Tonight we begin with a battered craft descending through the clouds of young Earth. Its passengers carry more than just their bodies. They carry memory, trauma and warnings etched into story. To us, they are remembered as Adam and Eve, the first of humankind. Yet under another lens, they may have been the last of another world, exiles from a dying planet, stepping into a garden so abundant it felt divine. From that beginning flowed myths of serpents, floods, and forbidden fruit, fragments of survival disguised as scripture. But before we get any further, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press of the like button goes a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, let us begin on Mars. The ground stretches wide, carved into pale trenches that wander with no water to fill them. Channels curl and split as if they once carried torrents strong enough to reshape a world. Yet nothing moves, only dust drifting in thin air where a river once spoke. It is a dead whisper of movement, a ghost carved into red stone. You picture yourself standing there, wind-lifting grains of iron-rich sand against the visor of a helmet, the outline of a riverbank stretching away like the memory of something lost. The silence presses deeper than a cave, because it is not a natural quiet. It is the silence left behind by something that will never return. When satellites from Earth first circled Mars, lenses pointed down into those valleys and dried deltas, tracing patterns that looked familiar. The outlines of branching channels resembled the Mississippi or the Nile from high above. Some operators compared notes, their monitors glowing dull green in dark rooms, realizing they were looking at a planet that once let water move freely. Instruments confirmed it. Minerals that require water to form, slopes that funnel into basins, fans of sediment frozen in place. These were the leftovers of lakes and seas drained long ago. On their screens, Mars no longer looked like the static beige disk in textbooks. It looked scarred, ancient, alive in absence. Not everyone accepted what that meant. To some, it was enough to say, yes, water was there long ago, and yes, microbes perhaps, but civilization, that was a much taller claim. Skeptics pointed out that rivers do not require people, canyons do not require architects. They reminded the enthusiasts that ice and wind sculpt freely without instruction. To believe in more was to walk the border of science and storytelling, and yet, in the dim light of a control room, a single operator watching faint sunlight trace across a Martian canyon might quietly wonder if the evidence whispered more than geology. Standing on Earth at the lip of the Grand Canyon feels overwhelming, mile-deep layers cut by time and river. Now stretch that image further. On Mars lies Valles Marineris, a wound slicing thousands of kilometers. If you stood on its rim, the opposite wall would vanish into haze. The silence there would feel less like geology, more like aftermath. Something vast had passed and never returned. Some scientists suggest that hundreds of millions of years ago, Mars wore oceans around its equator. Skies may have been thicker, holding clouds that broke apart into rain. Shallow seas shimmered under a smaller, weaker sun. If that happened, then Mars was not only a desert world stripped of breath. It was once a place where waves slapped at rocky shores and storms billowed wider than continents. Imagine standing on the shore of such a sea, long before dust claimed it. The air would have been heavier, tinted faintly orange by the smaller sun, but thick enough to carry the scent of wet stone. Waves would slap rhythmically against basalt cliffs, leaving foamy trails that reflected the pale light. Far off, dark clouds might coil into towers of storm, flashing with bursts of lightning that turned the entire horizon white for an instant. Where the storms broke, rain would hiss across the plain, feeding rivers that braided themselves into valleys now frozen in silence. On Earth, rivers have always birthed civilizations. The Nile carved a calendar of floods and harvests. The Indus Valley cradled cities with drains and streets aligned to stars. Even the Mississippi carried trade, culture, and ritual from one community to another. If Mars once wore its own network of flowing water, could its banks have served the same role? To see a river is to see a corridor, not just for water, but for life, exchange, and memory. One can almost picture settlements rising along Martian streams, their dwellings catching the glow of twin moons as night fell across an alien coast. The thought unsettles because it blurs a line we trust. Rivers are natural, yes, but everywhere on Earth they invited society. They shaped routes of migration, trade, and worship. Why should Mars be different? Supporters of the civilization theory argue that valleys like Ares Vallis or Valles might once have been arteries of a world alive with exchange. Critics counter quickly, erosion explains it all. But the resonance is hard to silence. Rivers carry memory wherever they run, and even when dry, they suggest patterns that feel older than geology. To stand by such a river on Mars would be to feel the same as standing by the Nile at dawn, or the Amazon at dusk. The sense that water is more than liquid, that it is continuity itself. On Earth, continuity became agriculture, temples, empires. On Mars, perhaps, it became something else entirely, now erased but not beyond imagining. Supporters of the civilization idea stretch further. If oceans were there, then maybe fleets of vessels crossed them, sails pulling under orange skies. Critics counter firmly. Oceans can exist without anyone to ride them. But the image lingers. The Viking orbiters of the 1970s brought one of the first truly intimate looks at these surfaces. Picture an operator with headphones pressed close, staring as screen after screen printed new images. They expected barren ridges, static plains. Instead, they traced long, knotted channels like knuckles of an old hand. He leaned close, pencil marking down coordinates, struck by the uncanny familiarity. These were rivers, but wrong. No roar of moving water behind them, no trace of green margins, only baking flats. In that moment, Mars tilted, from the planet that never had to a planet that once did. Each dried valley now serves as memory written into sediment. Just as on Earth, you can see beach lines from vanished seas etched into cliffs. Mars carries tattoos of old currents. Some whisper that the rivers are storylines left behind, still legible despite having lost their words. The silence of these landscapes is louder than windstorms. It tells of absence with the clarity of presence. A kind of archaeological still frame, waiting for context that may never arrive. Skeptics remind us, of course, that none of this proves even the faintest brush with society. For them, rocks frozen mid-flow demonstrate only time. A desert lakebed does not equal a forgotten port. Still, others suggest that if Martian oceans were stable for long enough, complexity had a chance. Life does not leap quickly from microbes to more, but given millions of years, possibilities widen. And if possibilities widen, then one could imagine city foundations buried under dust, old trade routes hidden beneath shifting dunes. Think of standing near the edge of one of those old channels. The cliff face breaks down into slabs of rust-coloured stone. At your feet, the ground looks fractured. In one crack rests a pebble, smooth despite centuries of no water. Pick it up in a gloved hand. The shape does not belong to sandstorms. It is the relic of tumbling currents. That single stone becomes evidence in miniature that Mars was once less alien. Multiply that across entire canyons, and you see a planet reborn in imagination, not in water. The rivers did more than cut. They carved stories that now lie unfinished. Imagine a small Martian settlement beside a stream, its flow steady under a dusky sky. Children skipping stones, a farmer shaping irrigation from canal to field. None of that is evidenced, but the form of the land keeps the image alive. Critics dismiss claims of such communities as romantic projection. Yet the ghost-likeness of those landscapes won't let go. They beckon, They invite completion. So what are those riverbeds? To mainstream scientists, clues to ancient hydrology, little more than terrain locked in stasis. To storytellers, they are corridors once travelled. The truth, perhaps, lies suspended between. The land has recorded liquid movement in its anatomy. Who or what was present during that time is unanswered, and unanswered questions have their own weight. The channels today sit lifeless, but the way they twist suggest guidance, the sort of branching chosen by rivers that lived in real time. Even when lifeless, they imply liveliness. One wonders if the stillness felt now is an echo of motion that defined an entire world. The record falls silent after that. Mars then was not always barren. Its valleys hold more than dust. They contain memory that lingers, shapes designed by forces we understand but outcomes we do not. They may be nothing but nature repeating itself, or they may outline where stories of life once unfolded, life not unlike ours. And if those dried rivers hint at lost waters, could they also hint at lost builders? The next question is waiting in the rocks themselves. In the thin dawn light of Mars, shadows stretch at angles that shouldn't belong to chance. From orbit, they gather into shapes, rows of triangles, sharp edges catching sunlight, and a lone structure shaped like a watching face. Photographs capture them with blunt precision, black and white contrast, jagged outlines softened by dust. To some, they appear as nothing more than rock. To others, they suggest deliberate forms, monuments trapped beneath ages of sand and silence. Whether you believe them natural or crafted, they settle into the imagination in a way that ordinary geology rarely does. Supporters of the civilization theory point to a handful of landmarks across the planet as proof of design. Among them, a pyramid-like mass often referred to as D and M, with angles that seem too even for erosion alone. Not far off, a five-sided structure tilts under sunlight, each side nearly proportional. And then there is the most haunting of them all, the so-called face on Mars, a mesa in Cydonia whose ridges and shadows give the impression of a giant sculpted human mask staring skyward. These forms fuel ideas of a Martian city, not of crude stone, but of vast planning and symmetry. Critics answer quickly. The mind looks for patterns where none exist. This tendency, called pareidolia, turns clouds into animals, wood grain into faces, and random stones into temples. For them, Martian mesas and ridges are no different. Wind, frost, and chemical weathering shaped them. Their angles appear sharp because of lighting conditions, not because of chisel or blueprint. Yet even when geology explains the basics, the designs appear unusual enough to keep debate alive. That is the tension, random forces against the suspicion of a lost architect. Neither side convinces all, leaving the debate to smoulder decade after decade. Now pause and picture workers under a deep red sky at dusk. The air would be thin but perhaps breathable with aid from domes or shields. Hands chip away at stone, placing slabs in careful sequence, while behind them vast towers glow faintly against the horizon, their glass casings reflecting orange clouds. Dust hisses across their boots as each block takes its place in a geometry that mirrors the stars. This image is speculation, but it anchors the cold photographs in something human. In it, workers build not ruins, but homes. They build not masks, but symbols of identity. Against a dying light, sweat meets stone in silence. The face on Mars gained a kind of celebrity status when released in 1976. One black and white frame captured what looked like an enormous human face gazing skyward. Newspapers ran it. Television segments speculated on its meaning. Some claimed it resembled the Sphinx half a world away in Egypt, a guardian ship frozen in rock. Others called it nothing more than shadows striking a bluff at just the right time. A quiet split opened in public imagination. Was this a mirror of ourselves staring back from another planet, or merely our own desire for company written into chance landforms? Even within NASA itself, reactions varied. Some engineers regarded the photographs with wry curiosity, while others dismissed them outright. What mattered is that the image refused to dissolve back into obscurity. It ignited books, lectures, late-night conversations. To believers, that face was a Rosetta Stone, a message sculpted across scale and era, left to tell us we were not alone. To skeptics, it was fuel for unnecessary distraction, keeping public eyes away from the real but less enchanting study of soil and atmosphere. Despite decades of higher resolution photographs showing more ordinary ridges, the memory of that face still lingers. The so-called pyramids of Cydonia add to the unease. Arranged in patterns, some claim they form alignments that match constellations, a trait we find in several ancient monuments on Earth. Temples across Mesopotamia, burial sites in the Andes, standing stones in Europe. They all point upward, tying societies to the night sky. Supporters suggest Mars too carried this impulse, aligning their designs with stars, embedding cosmology into architecture. Seen this way, symmetry is not accident but faith, not erosion but ritual. The echoes across cultures make the case tempting. Geometry is the language that survives when spoken words collapse into dust. What makes these structures haunting is their scale. Natural cliffs can look symmetrical, but the sighted Martian forms spread across kilometers, their features large enough to be seen from orbit. That visibility alone gives them a gravity that small anomalies cannot match. The photograph of the face, lonely yet vast, forces the viewer to reckon with intent. And if intent is there, then so too is civilization. Yet no tools, no carvings, no close-range artifacts have been found to anchor the argument firmly. We have shadows and lines, nothing more. But sometimes shadows and lines carry voices. Some whisper that these monuments were never for Martians themselves but built for posterity, left for whoever might come after. In that telling, they served not as homes or temples but as signposts planted into desert stone. The lack of ruins nearby is chalked up not to non-existence but to erasure. Time, storms, and catastrophe buried evidence, leaving the most durable shapes as markers. A face, a pyramid, a geometric cross-section. All messages across millennia that civilizations existed once here, but no longer. It is a tale of warning as much as vanity. We were here, but we are gone. The pattern reaches across worlds. On Earth we find echoes of the same impulse, monuments carved into human likeness, left to withstand the collapse of their makers. The Moai statues of Easter Island, immense heads staring blankly toward the horizon, seem less like architecture and more like a message cast into time. The Olmec heads of Mesoamerica do the same, their features preserved on a scale that dwarfs the individual. And in Egypt, the Sphinx stands as a hybrid guardian, its weathered face watching over desert sands long after kingdoms fell into ruin. None of these are simply functional. They are declarations. We were here. We wish to be remembered, which is why the face on Mars unsettles so deeply. If natural, it is coincidence, almost mocking in scope. But if intentional, it belongs to the same lineage of civilizations that sculpted stone into identity, leaving visages that survive when language and lineage fail. The scale itself suggests the audience was not ground dwellers but skywatchers, monuments large enough to be read from orbit, perhaps even from deep space. Some interpretations shift further still, suggesting these were not messages of pride but of warning. Faces turned upward in defiance, pyramids aligned not only to stars but to confront whatever descended from the sky. On Earth, myths speak of gods arriving from the heavens, battles fought with fire in the sky. Perhaps the builders of Cydonia carved their fear into the landscape itself, signs meant to endure long after the last inhabitant vanished, staring eternally at the void that once brought destruction. Critics counter again with stronger numbers. Surveyors examined countless other mesas and buttes across Mars, many of which, under certain lighting, produce the same illusion. shadows are consistent tricksters, shaping icons from random patterns, then dismantling them under new angles. The face is no different. High-resolution imaging reveals simple hills and depressions where once we saw lips and eyes. To them, the matter is ended. Proof sufficient. But the public imagination rarely responds to corrections as strongly as it does to a first impression. That is the paradox. Correction dulls the claim, but awe keeps it alive. Think of civilizations on Earth, now dusted into history. Stone circles left standing where entire cultures collapsed, ziggurats weathering into heaps, monoliths tracing forgotten rituals. Something in us responds to symmetry by assuming mind. That assumption is what links the pyramids of Mars to the pyramids of Earth. It is not evidence in the scientific sense, but resonance in the cultural sense. We see deliberate form greeting us through time and distance. And whether built or accidental, that resonance fuels a hypothesis of civilization that mainstream geology cannot erase. In the lull of late evening, when images of Cydonia project onto classroom walls or glow across computer screens, questions linger heavier than certainty. Were these monuments built to be seen from afar, grand symbols of presence, or are they merely the remains of chance dressed up by longing? Either way, they have served their role. They brought Mars into public imagination not as barren soil, but as a world that could have carried life, intelligence, artistry, and message. For that, they endure beyond their geological status, feeding the dream of cities beneath a red sky. Yet even cities, real or dreamed, do not escape fate. Behind every shining dome rises a darker outline, the spectre of collapse. And for Mars, that collapse was not gradual neglect, but something violent, swift, and final. The monuments may stand as stone, but around them stretch silence carved by devastation. And that devastation is where the trail leads next. Before we descend into the fire, fix one ordinary Martian day in place, so the loss has a face. Morning did not so much arrive as collect, thin light pooling against the city's translucent shields until the streets below accepted it. Outside the domes, red dust lifted in slow veils, combed by winds that could sand a cliff to a blade. Inside, the air trembled with the soft thrum of circulators and the subtle tick of thermal baffles heating stone. Children pressed fingerprints against the inner glass, racing each other along etched constellations in the floor, star maps older than their grandparents, a geometry that promised order even when the sky no longer did. In the agricultural quarter, mist beaded along cables where sieve farms pulled water from breath and weather. Rows of pale greens clung to vertical frames, their roots drinking from threads of captured condensation. An engineer in a grey mantle walked the aisles with a lamp, peering into housings, tightening a seal, tapping a sensor until its numbers steadied. A child held a shallow cup beneath a leaking joint and laughed when a clear drop found the centre. The sound carried down the corridor and faded, replaced by the careful hush of work. At the market, fabric sellers unrolled bolts dyed with mineral reds and iron browns that matched the desert beyond the dome. Musicians tuned long-necked instruments, whose lowest notes vibrated with the same pitch as wind in the external struts. Above the stalls rose glass-sleeved towers, their facets catching the sun in precise angles. At a certain hour, the first beam crossed the plaza from spire to spire and broke cleanly into 4 squares on the stones below. Conversations paused, heads tilted. It was not worship exactly. It was remembering, light pinned to a calendar that outlived kings. Midday heat laid a copper sheen over the streets. Couriers threaded through alleys with seal-stamped tablets pressed to their chests. At the city edge, a line of guardians tested the perimeter plates, stepping along the boundary where invisible fields met the pressure of dust. The plates sang when struck, a low metallic vowel that dropped back to silence. A captain made a note on her slate and looked up, storm lines on the horizon. braided like veins. In the Hall of Dust, the city performed its most careful ritual. Each resident in turn stood before a shallow basin of red sand and spoke a dream into it. Archivists listened through crystal cones that captured voice as pattern and translated it to etched lines in thin slabs of glass. A mason dreamed of rivers that ran uphill and woke weeping. A child saw a kite that refused to land, tugging its string toward a bright hole in the sky. An elder recited a corridor of doors with no walls, all opening at once. The archivist did not judge, they recorded. Dreams were civic memory. Whatever the night gave, the day would keep. Afternoon bled toward evening. Across the city, wind harps, thin ceramic veins mounted in alleys, began to sing as the exterior gusts rose. Their tones braided into chords only locals could pass. The weather's language, tuned to warn, to soothe, to call. Roof gardens lowered retractable grills over hardy shrubs. A teacher finished a lesson on navigational maths and, as students packed their slates, added a last sentence almost casually. You align the street grid to the heavens so that, if the heavens fail, the streets can still guide you. By dusk, the towers glowed. Inside their glass, filaments woke one by one, until a starfield seemed to rise from the city itself, streets forming a lattice that reflected the constellations overhead. From orbit, someone might have mistaken the city for a mirror of the sky. From the ground, citizens took comfort in the match. Parents pointed out the lines to their children. "Here we are," they said, tapping a bright intersection. "Here is the path to the well. Here is the way home if the lights go out." In the kitchen, steam lifted from bowls of broth rich with mineral salts. People broke loaves baked from hardy grains, coaxed to grow in shallow trays. A grandmother told a child a story about the first gardens under stone, when the air was poorer than now and every breath felt borrowed. The child listened, wide-eyed, the way children do when stories hold a kind of fear they don't yet have words for. Then quiet passed through the rooms like a shadow. Not the stillness of peace, but the pause of attention collecting somewhere else. In workshops above the plaza, engineers stood shoulder to shoulder around a dimmed console, watching a graph creep in the wrong direction. Messengers arriving at the south gate carried tablets bound with 2 seals instead of 1. The captain on the perimeter signed for them, read, and did not speak. She pocketed the orders and sent her squad to test the plates again, this time twice. At full dark, the second beam ritual began. The spires threw precise lines of light along the avenues until they met at the plaza's centre and formed a shape inlaid there generations ago. A cross grid, exact to the degree, aligned to 4 stars now faint behind a haze most pretended not to notice. People circled the pattern and placed their palms on its edges. Some closed their eyes and whispered a family name. Others stared hard at the sky as if by concentration alone they could hold it steady. No one said weapon, no one said war. They said weather, interference, anomalies. They said the words you use when naming a thing gives it too much reality. And still, work continued. Crops tended, seals checked, children taught, songs shared. A mason ran his hands across the face of a new stair and nodded, satisfied with the line. A baker slid the last loaf from a heat stone and turned off the coil. Lovers crossed a bridge whose rails had been polished smooth by decades of hands. It is tempting, after ruins, to imagine only grandeur or only arrogance. But the day most worth keeping is ordinary. It shows a people not as myths or warnings, but as neighbours you could have known. Their towers cut light at angles that made the city look like a map of stars. Their rituals fastened memory to glass and sand. Their instruments hummed, their wind harps sang. Their children learned to read by tracing constellations in the floor. They were not beginning, they were continuing. Hold that day. Now watch the sky change. There is a quietness to Martian dust that unsettles. Not because it hides nothing, but because under certain instruments it speaks faintly of violence. Within that fine red soil, scientists have traced elements not expected at such heightened levels. Chief among them is xenon 129, a strange isotope lingering like smoke long after fire. Mars seems saturated with it. The question is why? States of decay in radioactive elements can form xenon naturally, yet here the concentration is oddly heavy, far out of step with expectation. The presence lingers in ways that invite questions, and questions give rise to unlikely stories. Picture a small laboratory near midnight. Paper cups of stale coffee scattered across a desk. A scientist presses a detector close to a sample, reading drawn from Mars' atmosphere. The monitor flicks with numbers beyond prediction. He taps the screen, recalibrates, asks whether the device lags. The results remain fixed. Xenon 129, abundant. He leans back into his chair, uneasy. The data suggests, not demands, but suggests, something monumental had once flooded Mars with radiation on scales usually reserved for nuclear blasts. If real, this did not happen yesterday, not even in recorded history. It happened on the scale of millions of years, yet its faint trace still whispers across the data. To most planetary researchers, explanations sit in the safe territory of natural process. They argue xenon concentrations could reflect unusual planetary chemistry, or a pattern of atmospheric escape unique to Mars' gravity and climate. Such outcomes might result from solar flares, cosmic bombardment, or slow erosion of gases. Nothing here must imply civilization. Nothing requires firestorms and mushroom clouds. Yet there remains a gap. The scale, critics argue, is strangely large for these explanations. For them, Xenon 129's sharp signature looks suspiciously similar to a form of fallout. A fingerprint not of sun or rock, but of weapon. Supporters declare it echoes what a thermonuclear event might leave behind. Dr. John Brandenburg famously suggested something shocking. Mars might have been home to ancient societies destroyed by nuclear war. According to his theory, immense explosions scoured the planet, stripping away its habitability. He pointed to isotopes as silent witnesses. His claims are not broadly accepted, yet the thought they provoke is powerful. To envision an entire planet undone by weapons is to see Earth's own fears projected into astronomical distance. The scientist's idea is speculative, but its resonance lies in the question it raises. Are we staring at the debris of a planetary-scale crime scene? If there was a crime, what was the weapon? The isotopes suggest fire, but fire is only the residue. Somewhere behind the numbers waits a technology that left no wreckage, only chemistry written across the sky. Supporters of the ancient war theory sketch two possibilities, each stranger than the other. The first are what some call atmospheric knives, not bombs in the conventional sense, but resonant engines designed to vibrate the ionosphere until it's sheared apart. Imagine the sky itself turned into a drumhead, struck by invisible pulses until the protective shield shattered. No craters would remain, no melted husks, only an atmosphere bleeding away in silence. The story goes that such weapons would be chosen precisely because they erase their own fingerprints, killing not only populations but memory itself. The second possibility whispers of salted suns. Fusion devices seeded with exotic isotopes, detonated high enough that their firestorms left more signature in gas ratios than in soil. On Earth, such weapons are theoretical sketches in restricted archives, equations that make even hardened physicists pale. On Mars, the rumour insists they were built, tested, and finally unleashed. The planet would glow for minutes brighter than any aurora, then darken into silence. Xenon, krypton, and cesium would linger long after, not as artifacts you could hold, but as breath you could still measure eons later. Neither theory is proven. Both are little more than scaffolds built from the shape of anomalies. Critics call them fantasy, layered onto coincidence. But even they admit the scale of radiation is difficult to reconcile with ordinary geology. Volcanoes blacken skies, impacts melt plains, yet neither leaves isotope trails this sharp. Whatever happened on Mars, if it was natural, it mimicked perfectly the mathematics of weapons we ourselves nearly built. Picture the last days under such a threat. Alarms coded into towers, ski darkening not from storm but from resonance. Families pressing palms to glass as auroras curled unnaturally, not in green ribbons but in jagged sheets like scars ripped into night. Soldiers or guardians watching gauges climb beyond their design. No explosion heard, only silence spreading as pressure thinned. It would feel less like war than suffocation, a planet strangled by its own sky. Myths carry fragments of this. In some traditions, gods are said to wield weapons that silence rather than roar. Arrows that steal breath, winds that strip cities without flame. Even the serpent imagery bends here. Long, coiled machines hissing, not because they burned, but because they vibrated. If fire myths recall the light of salted suns, then serpent myths may recall the coils of atmospheric knives. Both lenses transform allegory into something colder, remembrance of weapons that left little but silence. And if the air itself was the target, then exile would not be option but mandate. Domes could not hold forever, circulation would falter, crops would fail. The only hope would be departure, even if it meant sending just a handful of survivors into the dark. Those who lived would carry not only trauma, but the memory of a war fought in silence, etched in bloodlines as cautionary tale. Xenon is not the only whisper in the data. Elevated traces of krypton and argon sit strangely in the mix, alongside ratios of cesium and strontium that echo fallout patterns known from Earth's own nuclear age. None of these elements alone prove anything extraordinary, yet together they sketch a picture that feels less like simple chemistry and more like aftermath, as if the planet itself still exhales remnants of a catastrophe millions of years old. Picture what such an event might have looked like from the ground. The thin Martian sky would ignite with curtains of false aurora, waves of radiation lighting clouds from within. Oceans would flash to steam, rain of glassy shards would hiss across valleys, and winds hotter than any desert storm would scour plains into silence. For inhabitants, if any still lived, the end would not arrive as a slow decline, but as an instant horizon of fire. Structures, if they stood, would be buried in ash and broken in a breath. To imagine this is to borrow the language of Earth's own weapons tests, but scaled until the entire planet is the proving ground. Critics, of course, resist this vision. They point instead to natural explanations. Massive solar storms flaring against a weaker magnetic field, cosmic impacts showering radiation across the atmosphere, or volcanic eruptions so immense they blanketed Mars in gases that skew isotope readings for millennia. None require civilizations, none demand weapons. To them, Xenon 129 and its companions are quirks of a world shaped by hostile space, not by its own hand. Yet even here the debate stumbles, for the sheer scale of the anomaly pushes against tidy explanations. The chemistry is possible, the resemblance to fallout remains. Layered across this eerie isotope tale are echoes from ancient texts on Earth. Hindu epics, particularly the Mahabharata, describe warfare of gods and kings marked by devastating fire. A single weapon said to brighten the sky like 1,000 suns, bodies turned to ash in moments, craters in the land. Those passages, written millennia ago, are often interpreted as myth or allegory. Yet, when held side by side with the imagery of nuclear annihilation, parallels appear. Bright light, searing heat, shadows imprinted into stone. Pictures we recognize from human history's own atomic era. Is it coincidence? Or does story carry memory longer than we admit? Some whisper the connection tighter, that Mars, scarred by its own conflict, seeded not only life on Earth, but also the myths we still recite. In that frame, ancient Indian texts carry faint impressions of extraterrestrial destruction retold in human tongue. Supporters suggest cosmic devastation echoes through myth as it filters across cultures. Critics counter firmly, mythology thrives on metaphors, and fire has always served as symbol. To equate it with nuclear description drags poetry into physics unfairly. And yet, when isolated fragments recur, flashes brighter than suns, ash-like residue, wastelands uninhabitable, it keeps the speculation restless. Consider again that lonely scientist with his detector. He has no weapons in hand, no direct ruins, no shimmering fragments of technology, only data, only decay and gas ratios, lingering where it should long have washed clean. The absence of artifacts makes the story sharper, not softer. If Mars endured nuclear devastation, nothing physical has survived it intact. No cracked metal husks, no melted reactors, no identifiable launch sites. All of it, if real, is erased. In its place clings chemistry, lodged like fingerprints on broken glass that has long since cooled. Sometimes what is missing tells the louder story. The eerie part lies in how complete the cleanup feels. Mars carries scars, canyons, dried plains of ocean, but direct, obvious weapons debris? None. So the idea persists. Perhaps this was no ordinary war, no conventional disaster. Perhaps it was something larger, more calculated, designed to obliterate not only life but evidence. Others dismiss such conjecture, citing the vast gulfs of geological time that grind everything down to dust. Mountains erode, seas vanish. Why should technology resist better than stone? The mystery stands here, silence and isotope, not silence alone. The pattern tilts in the light, its meaning sharpening under reflection. Think of Earth's atomic history compressed into hours, tests in deserts, cities scarred. A mushroom cloud climbs, dust coats the skin, and scientists leave records of isotopes drifting in air, soil, bone. Xenon, cesium, strontium, they stay long after flames cool. Mars carries echoes reminiscent of that. The scale unsettles people because the planet has no Hiroshima, no Nevada desert test site. It had no reason we can plot, no politics we can trace. And still the elemental fallout is measurable. This is where mainstream interpretation hesitates. Mainstream arguments stress cosmic rays and volatile chemistry. Fringe voices reply, the resemblance runs too neat. Listen to that tension. On one side, ordinary science, elements reacting in unpredictable but natural ways. On the other, human narrative instincts, fingerprints, fires, wars. The genius and the flaw of the human mind is that it ties patterns to stories. A residue becomes weapon, a myth becomes history. Somewhere between sits an itch not entirely soothed by either explanation. That is what makes the possibility persistent, not proved, just persistent. Science can model chemistry, but imagination stays awake, carrying questions. If, as Brandenburg suggests, fire once swept across Mars, then the structures we looked at earlier may not only be ruins abandoned by time, but ruins deliberately buried by violence. Cydonia's shapes may not simply belong to erosion, but to cities caught mid-breath, flash fossilized by unimaginable force. Others dismiss this outright, citing closer imaging and geology textbooks as counterweight. Still, the isotope record does not fade. And there it sits, a ghost of global fire whispering under the surface. Something catastrophic did indeed touch Mars, whether cosmic chance or deliberate weaponry. The mark it left is nuclear in tone. The soil still whispers. The air, thin as it is, still carries signatures. These cannot be erased by storm or wind. They endure. As they endure, questions ripple outward. If such fire finished the planet, who watched it happen? Who witnessed the final red horizon? And who, if anyone, remained to see the end? The chemistry whispers of violence, but myths thunder of war. If xenon traces suggest fire, then ancient stories add shape to that fire. Battles so immense they left memory scorched into language. Across civilizations, the refrain repeats. Wars in the heavens, weapons of impossible brightness, destruction that remade the world. What geology hints at, myth describes in poetry. Consider the Mahabharata, where weapons are said to blaze brighter than 1,000 suns, flattening armies in an instant. The ground is described as poisoned, survivors wandering wastelands where hair and nails fell away. Details disturbingly similar to radiation sickness. Critics insist these are metaphors, epic exaggerations of Iron Age warfare. But placed beside Martian isotopes, the resonance deepens. Perhaps what we call epic memory is in fact displaced memory, an echo of devastation carried across worlds. The Popple view of the Maya tells of skylords battling with fire and flood, their power descending from above to sweep away the first creations. Greek myth recalls the Titanomachy, where Olympians and Titans waged war with bolts of fire hurled across heaven, leaving the earth scarred. Even Revelation in the Christian canon describes Michael and his angels warring against the dragon, a cosmic battle whose debris falls upon the world below. Each account filters violence through local symbols, yet the structure remains startlingly consistent. Conflict erupts above, fire rains downward, the world below is transformed. Some whisper these were not coincidences but fractured memories of a single event. A war fought on Mars when its civilizations reached their zenith. Perhaps rival powers unleashed technologies so devastating they not only destroyed their world, but seeded myths of apocalypse into every culture their survivors later touched. In this telling, Mars did not simply fall to accident or natural disaster. It was murdered by its own children. Picture the Martian sky in its final days. Not the soft pale we see now, but a thin atmosphere trembling with aurora like curtains of radiation. Blinding flashes streak between cities, weapons arcing across the horizon. Towers collapse, seas flash to vapour, and the thin air thickens with dust and plasma. From orbit it would look like two suns had bloomed on the surface, fireballs clawing upward before fading into silence. For those below it was not metaphor, it was the end. Critics dismiss this as projection, our species imprinting its own atomic fears onto alien soil. They point out how every culture dramatizes conflict, and how myths magnify natural disasters into wars of gods. To them, Titanomachy is thunderstorm, not technology. The Mahabharata is metaphor for dynastic feuds, not nuclear exchange. And yet the parallels refuse to dissolve. Fire brighter than suns, shadows burned into stone, wastelands left uninhabitable. Over and over the fragments return. If such wars did unfold, their silence now is almost complete. No melted husks, no rusting weapons, only chemistry and soil and stories refracted through centuries. But silence itself is haunting, for silence means the victors did not survive either. What kind of war ends not with triumph, but with extinction? What kind of species carries only two survivors across the void? It is here that the myths pivot. Wars fade, but the memory of survivors lingers, and from the horizon of fire rises the image of exile. Two shadows crossing the void, carrying the last fragments of a broken world. A small craft drifts into the dark between worlds, battered, sparks flickering at its seams. Behind it, a red horizon glows faint and broken, as though the very sky has been torn open. The planet that birthed it is dying, its air thinning, its rivers boiled away. Inside the escape vessel sit two passengers, not conquerors or heroes, but survivors clutching remnants of a world already gone. The hiss of mechanical failure surrounds them, the low groan of systems straining against emptiness. There is no guarantee they will reach anything, only desperation drives the machine forward. This is how the story opens in the whispers of certain lore. Mars consumed by fire, its people scattered or extinguished, and from that inferno came only two who endured, clinging not to weapons or treasures, but to memory. The tale narrows the frame of billions down to a pair of human shapes, their breath heavy inside a craft that smells of ozone and char. It is a mythic reduction, disaster broken into something small enough for memory to hold. In that smallness lies survival, the chance for continuity when an entire civilization has been erased. Critics dismiss this story out of hand. For them it is simple allegory, a poetic device to give shape to cosmic destruction. They argue two survivors would not carry enough genetic diversity to seed a species. They stress the frailty of a vessel leaping from planet to planet in such ancient times. But the myth endures, and endurance itself is its own form of evidence, not of fact, but of force. If stories linger for ages, retold across continents, something within them strikes deeper than reason alone. In this image, the pair are not idealized. They are not kings or saviors. They are frightened but determined, carrying more than bodies. They hold seeds of crops, patterns of language, fragments of culture etched in their consciousness. They carry genes that will replicate through generations, bearing echoes of a lost homeland in bone and blood. Their faces are nothing special, perhaps scarred by the final storms that scoured Mars. But their ordinariness amplifies the weight of what they hold. They are not beginnings. They are continuations disguised as origins. Some whisper that this pairing survives into the earliest written traditions we still carry. In this view, the Book of Genesis may be less creation myth than recollection garbled by centuries. Adam and Eve become not Earth's first man and woman, but the final Martians exiled to a younger, fresher world. In that retelling, the Garden of Eden is no mystical paradise. It is Earth itself, green, wet, abundant, seen by alien eyes as overwhelming in its lushness. After watching oceans fade into dust, even a single river would appear divine. A new sky blanketed in blue might carry the terror and wonder that scripture later turned into paradise. Picture two refugees stepping out into prehistoric Earth. Dense air fills their lungs, almost intoxicating after the whisper-thin remnants of Mars. Insects hum at volumes they have never heard. Water runs broad and deep, its sound a roar compared to the weak trickles of their old planet. Eden, in this light, is nothing supernatural. It is simply contrast heightened into revelation. The trauma of loss reshaped perception, and that perception reshaped into myth. Humanity's origin, as told later, might merely be the record of two survivors trying to name what they had found. The Serpent of Eden, often blamed for trickery, shifts character in this perspective. Some suggest it might remember the war machines of Mars, slender, coiled, hissing with energy, capable of ending lives in an instant. Others propose it is symbolic of dangerous knowledge they carried in themselves, the gnawing awareness of technologies lost, weapons that once lit a sky brighter than suns. In both views, the serpent becomes less an animal and more a memory scar. It slides into the myth not from zoology but from trauma, coded as warning for the generations to come. And then there is the fruit. In Genesis it is an apple, in some retellings a fig, in others simply an unnamed object of temptation. If this story links back to Mars, that forbidden fruit may not be food at all. It could instead mark the body of knowledge the survivors carried silently across the void. Weapon schematics locked away, genetics beyond the age expected, science that could be both gift and curse. Eating the fruit, then, is not disobedience. It is reckoning with dangerous inheritance. To open that memory might promise power, but it also risks repeating the devastation that drove them here. The beauty of oral tradition is its ability to stretch while carrying core fragments across centuries. Elders murmured tales by firelight, words twisted by translation, yet still conserving outlines of disaster, exile, and rebirth. Across cultures we find pairs at the origin, first parents, wanderers, chosen ancestors. Some whisper that is no coincidence. Each is a refracted memory of the same ancient loss, two travellers stepping off a battered machine onto alien soil. Their voices fade into myth, but their story survives underneath, coded into every narrative where humanity begins with two. The echoes reach further than Genesis. In Norse lore, the first humans were Jaska and Embla, shaped from driftwood and placed at the threshold of a new world. In Navajo tradition, first man and first woman wander through underworlds before emerging into the surface world. Polynesian stories tell of the first voyagers who braved open seas, carrying the seeds of plants and fragments of memory into untouched islands. Each tale compresses origins into a pair. Two carriers who embody continuity when everything else has been swept away. Critics often chalk these parallels up to simplicity. Every lineage needs a beginning, and 2 is the smallest number that works. Yet the pattern feels too insistent to dismiss. When myths separated by oceans and millennia converge on the same shape, 2 survivors stepping into a strange land, it whispers of a common memory refracted through culture. If the story of Adam and Eve is one echo of Martian exiles, then perhaps Aska and Embla, first man and first woman, and the voyagers of the Pacific are other fragments of the same ancient event. What lingers is not only the shape of the myth, but the psychology of survival itself. Imagine 2 refugees arriving in an overwhelming new world, haunted by the loss of billions left behind. Every sound is sharper, every colour amplified, every river terrifying in its abundance. Trauma sears memory into sharper lines than peace ever could. Their descendants would inherit not the details of war machines or isotopes, but the feeling of survival, compressed into archetypes of warning, exile, and renewal. That inheritance explains why myths so often start not with triumph, but with loss. When read this way, creation stories transform from simple allegories of morality into chronicles of survival. Adam and Eve, instead of being made from dust of this planet, are dust from another world reformed in a desperate continuity. Our myths become less about divine genesis and more about the stubbornness of existence itself, how life refuses extinction even when entire planets collapse. The structure of our earliest tales may be nothing less than a survival message embedded in culture, a message that comes not from gods but from ancestors displaced by cosmic catastrophe. Supporters of this diaspora idea argue that the persistence of pair origin myths is too striking to dismiss. They trace echoes from the Middle East to the Americas, from Africa to the Pacific. Different names, different symbols, but the same shape. Humanity arises from 2. Others counter that such structures are inevitable, artifacts of human imagination seeking simplicity. To start a lineage with a pair is not evidence, they say, but narrative economy. Yet despite dismissal, the lore grows richer with every cultural parallel that emerges. The resonance lies not in proving mechanics, but in embracing the haunting possibility that humanity is not local, that our bones carry chemistry forged on Mars, carried by 2 shadows who crossed the void. We may, in this telling, exist as the continuation of their exile. Our myths are their diary, written in symbols when words began to fail. The faces we paint as divine may simply be their descendants, remembering in distorted form what once unfolded in fire. If true, then myth is not metaphor alone. It is a fractured memory, half preserved across time, shards of origin scattered across language and culture. And if that is the case, then every retelling whispers the same hidden point. That human history is older, stranger, and interplanetary. The shadows leaving Mars may not have only crossed the void of space, they may have crossed the void of time, carrying their story until we still murmur it tonight in the form of myth. And if myths are fragments of memory, what might they yet recall? The logbooks that survived contain only fragments. Day 12. The ship does not sing so much as tick. Heat expands the plates in the hull, and they answer each other down the spine of the craft like water dripping inside a cavern. We ration breath. Not air, the scrubbers are holding, but the kind of breath that wastes rhythm. The doctor taught us to count 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, the ancient pattern of calming soldiers and mothers alike. We keep the cabin lights low to save power. A brown sachet of seeds is strapped to the wall beside the viewport. A small flag from a world already receding. We talk in whispers, even though sound does not carry to vacuum. It is habit from the last weeks under the dome, when alarms lived in the air and quiet felt like rescue. My partner shows me the map they carved on their forearm with a needle and ink from a broken pen. A crude grid of stars, the same geometry the city lit each night. If the instruments die, they say, we still have this. I nod and say nothing. The ship keeps its slow count. We learn the language of creaks. Day 37. A storm we cannot see touches us anyway. The meter by the forward bulkhead hiccups and refuses to return to baseline. The readout is a stubborn bruise of numbers. We do not have the words for the old weapons, only the nicknames the market vendors used in whispers. Serpents and suns. Out here, there are no serpents or suns, only the long aftertaste of what they left behind. The doctor tapes a circle on the floor with black cloth and calls it the quiet place. We sit inside it, knees touching, and breathe until the meter flattens. It is probably meaningless, and yet it works. A cluster of impacts arrives like hail. You do not hear them, you feel them, a tiny cascade through the bones. One leaves a kiss in the outer skin, and we burn a fraction of fuel to turn the wounded side away from what we think is the stream. The coarse computer argues and then obeys. Later we check the ration box and find a block of gel has crystallized. We joke that even the food has decided to become a rock, a fragment of the world we fled. The joke is not funny, but it keeps us from crying. At sleep we dream noises from childhood, wind harps in alleys, the sieve farms dripping like rain that never truly fell. I wake with my hand pressed to the ceiling and realize I was reaching for glass. The dome, in the dream it held. It always held, until it didn't. Day 61. The guidance array glitches. Our city taught children to navigate by star grids. The streets aligned so well that if you memorize the crossings, you could find your way even under blackout. Now we use the same memory to steer a ship. We tape the pattern to the panel and line the crosshairs by hand. The computer sulks but follows. When the screen is dark, we hold our breath and move our fingers above the controls as if prayer could power circuits. Perhaps it can. Perhaps that is all prayer ever was. Practice for touching fragile things without breaking them. We take turns telling stories so we do not forget the names of roads and rooms. I tell them about the Hall of Dust and how the archivists etched dreams in glass. They tell me about the teacher who said, "Align the streets to the heavens so that, if the heavens fail, the streets can still guide you." We decide to pretend the ship is only an alley longer than other alleys, and that if we keep walking it will eventually return us to the plaza where light fell in clean squares. We know this is impossible. We do it anyway. Day 74. We rotate the ship for heat and notice a smear in the black. So faint we argue whether it is a mark on the viewport. It is not. The smear fattens over the following days, turning blue at the edges. The first time the cabin fills with scattered light, we both flinch like animals. Our eyes have learned to live inside rust and dim. Blue hurts. It is also the most beautiful pain I have ever felt. We burn another fraction of fuel we promise not to touch. The ship answers with a growl and then an obedient hum, as if pleased to be aimed at something other than absence. Day 79. Atmosphere begins as a suggestion on a dial, then becomes a presence, then a body. The hull shudders and the walls speak in a new voice. Heat claws the skin of the craft and the cabin fills with smells not from machines. Wet stone, iron, resin, a sweetness like crushed leaves. For a few seconds we think we're dying in a fire. We're not. We're falling into air. The doctor's tape circle lifts at one edge and flutters like a petal. My partner laughs and it sounds wrong and right at once, like the first breath after grief. The noise ends. The world starts. We hit water not with a crash but with a slap that says, "You are heavy and I accept you." The craft rocks and spins and rights itself. We open a panel that should not open, and a smell climbs in that makes both of us choke. Life. It is thick and green and intimate and impossible. The sachet of seeds on the wall trembles in the draught, and we both reach for it at the same time. Our hands meet. For a long minute we do not move. We crawl out under a sky that looks unfinished, as if a patient artist had thrown too much colour on one canvas and then refused to stop. Insects make a racket so layered we think at first it is machinery. Water runs broader than memory allows. The weight of air sits on our shoulders like a blessing that remembers being a burden. We kneel because knees are what you use when you cannot stand and refuse to lie down. We drink. It tastes of stone and a metal and sweetness and the end of disbelief. At dusk we see the first serpent, a long thing coiled on a branch, watching us with a patient, lidless eye. It does not hiss. It does not glow. It is only an animal. We nod at it like a citizen passing another in a market. Later, when the stories begin, it will change shape until children can hold it in their hands without fear. For now, it is only witness. That night we do not sleep because sleep belongs to safety and language we have not learned yet. We sit and listen to the world breathing around us and try to teach our lungs its rhythm. I hold the sachet of seeds and think of a basin of red sand far away, filled with the dreams of a city that has no more mornings. We will plant, my partner says, though there are no tools and no plan and no promise. I say yes because agreement is the only thing you can plant when you have nothing else. We do not speak of going back. There is nowhere to go. They hit atmosphere like a prayer, and the prayer answered back as forests. The first sensation is rising water. A silence across the land as streets vanish, huts tremble, and firewood floats uncontrolled. Whole villages loosen from their roots and slip under a tide that shows no mercy. Picture firelight returning after that storm. Survivors gather close, their clothes still damp from the flood, steam lifting from soaked logs. Elders begin speaking in heavy tones, narrating the ruin not just as disaster but as lesson. What was lost is framed as part of an older cycle. Destruction before renewal, ruin paired with rebirth. This rhythm hardens into memory, and memory eventually settles into myth. Historians note how uncanny it is that cultures from distant coasts all hold these kinds of stories. Mesopotamian myths tell of great waters sweeping across plains, washing palaces from their foundations. Far away, tales among Mesoamerican people record deluge swallowing forests until only mountaintops remained safe. In Pacific Islands, oral accounts describe ancestors saved at the last moment by canoes lifted high over waves that rose higher than palm trees. The details shift, but the theme repeats. The world collapses underwater. Those who live through it become carriers of wisdom. Flood becomes both punishment and beginning. Supporters of the Martian survival idea suggest these parallels are not coincidence. They propose the common thread is not local river floods, but a single trauma remembered across ages, the drowning of an entire planet's potential. Mars, once filled with seas, went dry under catastrophe. To carry that into Earth legend, survivors may have translated drought into flood. What was once a vanishing of water became the overflowing of water, a cosmic reversal retold through generations. Critics argue instead that rivers flood everywhere, storms fall everywhere. An independent invention explains repetition. Still, the echoes feel heavier than chance. When firelit gatherings recited myths centuries later, the serpent often crept into the tale. On clay tablets from Sumer, serpents guard hidden knowledge. In later biblical accounts, a serpent tempts the first people. In Mesoamerican lore, a feathered serpent grants culture, power, and sometimes destruction. Some whisper these were not mere snakes, but the memory of machinery, long and coiled, hissing with energy, perhaps weapons remembered as slithering demons. Others counter that snakes simply inspire fear across human environments, their presence too natural to require cosmic origin. Yet the serpent, as technology lingers as one of those unsettling possibilities, myths never quite let go. and then the fruit. It appears across traditions as something marked forbidden, whether the apple of Eden, sacred corn sometimes withheld by gods, or berries guarded by spirits. Supporters of the Martian story reframe it from fruit to knowledge, something dangerous carried across the void, wrapped in secrecy, remembered later as a thing that could be touched, tasted, consumed. Eating it was no act of hunger, but of defiance. In this lens, the forbidden fruit records our inheritance of science, details of energy, genetics, weaponry, burdensome gifts disguised as temptation. Critics reply that fruit represents fertility, reproduction, morality, not physics. Even so, temptation as knowledge threads itself clearly through. Picture a small village near Sumer long ago. Clay huts crowd the banks of a swelling river. Torches flicker as floodwaters recede. A scribe marks soft clay tablets with a reed by firelight, pressing lines that will outlast generations. Around him, voices recall how gods raged and waters rose higher than temples. Perhaps he has lost his own family to the flood. He presses harder into clay, as if writing deeper could anchor memory more firmly into the world. What he does not know is that across oceans, others spoke similar words into cedar, bark, or bone. Different objects, same story. From Gilgamesh's flood tablet to tales of Quetzalcoatl, from Norse sagas of Ymir's drowning in primal waters, to oral histories among Aboriginal Australians of rising seas swallowing islands, the structure repeats. Cultures far removed in geography converge on parallel patterns. This wide net of repetition is precisely what fuels speculation of a shared origin. Either the floods of Earth mirrored each other so consistently that myths naturally rhymed, or all were faint echoes of a single greater collapse displaced into familiar imagery for survival's sake. Each telling is distorted by centuries of translation, but corners of the original image show through the blur. In China, stories tell of the Great Yu, a culture hero who laboured for years to tame floods that had swallowed valleys and plains. The water was said to rise so high it touched the heavens, forcing survivors to carve channels just to reclaim the land. Among Native American traditions, tribes along the Pacific Northwest recount deluges that destroyed villages, leaving only those who fled to mountain ridges. Aboriginal Dreamtime songs speak of waves that blotted out entire coasts, reshaping the outline of the land itself. Though oceans and rivers differ, the refrain is the same. Disaster swallows, survivors adapt, memory persists. Picture a smaller moment tucked inside one of these flood tales. A child crouches near a fire as elders recount the rising waters. She's too young to grasp politics or cosmology, but she hears the tremor in their voices. Each retelling hardens the shape of the event until it becomes more than memory. It becomes ritual. The child grows, repeats the story, adds emphasis to the serpent or the forbidden object, shaping trauma into symbol. By the time centuries pass, the raw event is gone, but the rhythm of loss and warning remains. This is how memory threads itself into culture, not with precision, but with persistence. In this sense, flood myths were never just about catastrophe. They were about healing. Communities gathered to speak of what had been lost, not to wallow in grief, but to carry forward a sense of renewal. To say we survived is to reaffirm identity in the face of erasure. If Mars collapsed and its survivors whispered fragments into early human culture, the repetition of floods, serpents, and forbidden fruits may be less about allegory and more about recovery. The stories soothed the descendants even as they disguised the origin. Myths became survival tools, medicine in the form of memory. Human imagination distorts, but it also preserves. You can test this by whispering a phrase through a long line of people. At the far end, the phrase changes, yet fragments remain recognizable. Myths may work the same way. The story of beings fleeing cataclysm across space might, after thousands of years of retelling by firesides, become the story of families fleeing floods. Serpents that once rattled with weaponized energy might become garden tricksters. Knowledge once forbidden because of its destructive capacity might become sweet fruit asked to be left alone. The shapes drift, but the weights remain. Some whisper that this is why myths still carry such immediacy in tone. They are distorted, but distortion does not erase urgency. When an elder insists that floods follow disobedience, perhaps behind the moral warning lies deeper fear. That old forbidden knowledge once brought actual destruction, and forgetting it is necessary for survival. To this frame, myth is not simply allegory but active defense. Hide dangerous truths within stories of morality, shift technology into animal, wrap nuclear fire into divine punishment, and memory is both preserved and shielded. Skeptics stress caution. They argue repeating structures prove little beyond the psychology of human storytelling. Pairing destruction with rebirth is common because it provides hope. The serpent, exotic and fearsome, is a natural antagonist. Food transformed into taboo resonates across agricultural societies. Combined, these patterns require no interplanetary diaspora. Yet even as critics outline practical answers, the human undercurrent finds itself pulled back to the what if. What if these recurring themes are not cultural coincidences but the bruised fingerprints of Mars' last witnesses, pressed into myth before their voices fell quiet? Think again of that small Sumerian villager, hands pressed in clay. He does not know what atmosphere Mars once held. He does not grasp isotopes or cosmic exile. But he knows his community speaks of overwhelming water and that the story matters. Around him, neighbours nod as he writes. Fairness does not matter, evidence does not matter, continuity does. He inscribes trauma into permanent shapes because trauma slips easily into silence when unrecorded. Every repeating motif may be the residue of that act, a human attempt to stop forgetting. Parallels multiply the longer you search. South American epics speak of fires falling from sky prior to floods. In African lore, disasters come as punishment for hidden knowledge taken too freely. Polynesian traditions describe waves blotting out lands, survivors drifting toward renewal, all reframe devastation as prelude to rebirth. That balance resembles the narrative arc. Mars thrives, Mars collapses, remnants survive. Stories are heavy with cycles because cycles served ancestors as meaning. Yet within the pattern sits a constant undertone. Vehicle machines that hiss like serpents, knowledge untouchable as fruit, waters rising beyond reason. An undertone too specific for some to ignore. Even if much is distortion, distortion functions like mist over mountains. Peaks appear blurred, but you know they are there. Floods, serpents, forbidden fruit, layer after layer of cross-cultural likeness, hint at an older shape looming behind. The further back you trace, the clearer the suggestion becomes that all these tales might once have pointed to cosmic memory, not earthly temper. If so, then humanity's most cherished myths are not invention, but fragments of genuine history shrouded in metaphor. As myths ripple onward, storytellers inherit not only entertainment but obligation. They may not realize what they carry, yet the repetition implies weight. If ancient floods across Earth can all echo one original calamity, then perhaps they are not warnings about ordinary storms at all. Perhaps instead they are coded memorials, faint reminders of Mars' ending retold in human tongues. If myths can bend to preserve memory, then perhaps the planet itself still carries fragments. Each anomaly becomes less geology and more reminder. And the question is no longer whether they existed, but whether we are ready to face what they left behind. The images arrive as silent transmissions from far away, each one black and white before filters render them into shades of red and brown. In those frames, ridges rise like low waves frozen mid-motion. Elsewhere, blocks of stone throw sharp shadows at clean right angles. A darker form sits upright, a narrow monolith with edges so clean it looks as if it had been quarried. Another image seems stranger, a dark slit in cliffside rock, narrow, rectangular, like a doorway waiting for footsteps that never come. Each frame reaches Earth sterile and digital, but what the eye interprets is not sterile at all. The texture invites judgment, and the judgment splits the room. The terrain could be normal geology. Wind, freeze and thaw cycles, the planets of our solar system all repeat such processes endlessly. That is the view mainstream science embraces. But those with different inclinations focus on the improbability of clean angles repeating across multiple sites. Where skeptics see randomness, enthusiasts measure symmetry. Proportion becomes suspect. A rectangle half buried in sediment looks less like erosion and more like abandoned architecture. Supporters suggest the persistence of these forms indicates intent rather than accident. Critics counter without hesitation. Erosion makes straight lines when given enough patience. Yet the debate itself grows louder each time new photographs arrive. Among the controversies was the peculiar sequence once referred to informally by critics as the cat box image. Early photos of the face on Mars were released in a format where contrast and resolution blurred, producing outlines that seemed artificial. Later, as data sharpened and was processed with newer methods, the face softened into natural topography. To skeptics, clarity ended the dispute. To others, the change looked like tampering. A belief stirred that images had been deliberately altered before public release. Engineers explained shifts as simple adjustments of contrast and resolution. Conspiracy writers insisted those adjustments were filters disguising evidence. Thus, what should have clarified only deepened suspicion. Now place yourself in a control room on Earth. A technician sits before banks of glowing screens, hands moving across keyboards, cycling through filters. Each tweak of brightness and gamma pull shifts stone from smooth to jagged, from natural to uncanny. Headphones pinch tight across ears. Somewhere in a folder lies the raw image, the one few eyes see. Nearby rests the polished version meant for public release. In that thin space between images lies trust, and trust grinds easily when shadows harden into shapes resembling monuments. Some whisper that what the public receives is always a softened reality, tidied of anomalies that could complicate narrative. Take, for example, the alleged doorway. A cropped section of a cliff shows what looks like a tall rectangle cut into stone. Supporters seize on its dimensions, nearly uniform width from top to base, edges too precise to be dismissed casually. Photographs from rover missions revealed shadows playing inside its depth, giving it the illusion of an entry into some chamber. Others dismiss it readily. A shallow fracture enlarged by collapse, coincidence dressed as engineering. Yet the comparison between common fractures and this singular form leaves the argument restless. Even if only an illusion, it lingers visually in ways erosion rarely does. Consider also the isolated monolith captured on Mars' moon Phobos. A lonely, strikingly upright feature towering from the ground like a marker placed with deliberation. Its flat sides and vertical stance contrast sharply with the rubble strewn around it. Comparisons draw to menhirs in Europe, or standing stones scattered across far older Earth cultures. Some enthusiasts call it a marker left intentionally. Others note it might be nothing more than a block loosened and lodged upright after a landslide. The tension repeats, chance geology against deliberate placement. Neither side concedes, because both explanations remain plausible. It is interpretation that swings perception, not the rock itself. Think of what such a marker means when compared to Earth. The moai of Easter Island stand alone against wind and salt, guardians without explanation. The Nazca lines in Peru stretch for miles, designs only visible from the air. Even Britain's standing stones form alignments that speak to eyes above as much as to people gathered on the ground. Each culture, across continents, left shapes too large or strange to ignore. echoes of communication meant to endure across time and distance. When Phobos shows its own lone marker, it resonates with that same impulse, the desire to carve permanence into landscapes that might otherwise erase us. Now imagine the technician receiving the raw image of such a feature. He scrolls past endless frames of dust and rubble, then stops when one file shows the improbable vertical shadow. Does his hand pause for a moment before tagging it for processing? Does he wonder if the outline might be more than fracture? For him, protocol demands neutrality. Pixels become datasets, anomalies become quirks. Yet behind that neutrality there is still a human mind, still curiosity pressing against procedure. Even if nothing is hidden deliberately, suspicion grows, because human judgment is always in the loop. In this way, anomalies on Mars generate not only arguments about stone, but also narratives about ourselves. Were images blurred, cropped, or sharpened too far? Was one filter chosen over another? Each choice spins into conspiracy. The monuments do not sit passively in Martian soil. They ripple outward into earthly lore, where every technician's keystroke becomes part of the mythology. The debate ceases to be about a monolith or a doorway alone. It becomes about trust, perception, and the unease that arises when certainty is promised but never delivered. Modern rovers added new puzzles. A cropped frame showed what looked like a doorway cut into stone, its edges too straight for comfort. Another image revealed a monolith on Phobos, Mars's tiny moon, rising like a marker against rubble. These aren't vast pyramids, but smaller anomalies, fractures, blocks, upright stones that still whisper of intent. Each one is dismissed as coincidence, yet their repetition keeps the argument alive. Across decades, anomalies never vanish completely. Every new rover brings back high-resolution files meant to settle doubt, yet instead each dataset stirs the coals again. The doorway image, once dismissed, is cited again. Monoliths reappear in conversation. Patterns receive new measurements with each technological advance. For those convinced of something hidden, each fresh transmission is not closure but renewal. In this way, anomalies survive regardless of explanation. They endure because they appeal to imagination as much as to data. What scientists call geology is, for some, a code too deliberate to ignore. It is easy to dismiss claims of artificial design as projection, but what sustains them is repetition. Not one doorway, but several fractures shaped suspiciously. Not one monolith, but scattered examples. Not one mound alignment, but clusters echoing constellations. Supporters claim the scale of repetition tips probability away from accident. Critics reply that when you scan a planet, repetitions are inevitable. Look long enough at clouds and faces appear. Look long enough at stone and rectangles reveal themselves. And yet even those dismissing the speculation find themselves pausing when edges look too straight. Doubt is wary because the images, plain as they are, still hold mystery. Think again of that technician seated at a console, toggling colours that decide what billions will see. To him, it is routine. Edit saturation, smooth rough edges, calibrate contrast. Decisions made in minutes flow outward into decades of speculation. His hand rests on a mouse steady, unthinking. But each pixel he modifies may soften the perception of a ridge that, had it been preserved raw, might have convinced millions otherwise. The human action embedded in this process becomes part of the lore. Not just Martian anomalies, but earthly management of those anomalies, and what lingers more heavily, the shapes seen or the suspicion they were hidden. The persistence of Martian anomalies suggests that even at highest photographic clarity, questions do not die. Instead, they grow. If the doorway is confirmed shallow shadow, what of the pyramidic mound nearby? If the face is mesa after all, what of the symmetric five-sided forms down the valley? Disproving one anomaly never erases the presence of the whole field. To those convinced, every confirmation of natural origin leaves untouched others not so easily explained. To skeptics, stringing them together is nothing more than layering coincidences. Still, the conversation never goes silent. Mars refuses to be just geology. Its landscapes, even stripped of myth, carry uncanny weight. The forms are ordinary yet compelling, explainable yet stubborn in imagination. Each new rover confirms detail, yet detail never ends the speculation. Instead, the planet itself seems to invite disagreement, as if its very terrain was built to challenge certainty. Whether artifact of a vanished culture or the trickery of erosion, Mars glows in human thought as more than rock. It is signal or illusion, or both together. The truth, perhaps, lies in how such images refuse disappearance. They raise but never conclude. The takeaway becomes clear only in feeling. Martian anomalies endure because they function like mirrors. They reflect what each of us brings: curiosity, skepticism, longing for connection in the cosmos. The shapes may be mere shadows, but shadows entertain depth. Even at highest resolution, Mars holds enough geometry to stir wonder. It endures. And if such images hint that we ourselves are tied somehow to this other world, they frame a deeper question. If our origins truly stretch from Mars, then the monuments still cut in stone are not alien anomalies at all. They are homes remembered. And how would that reshape everything we believe about humanity? Stone is stubborn. It weathers slowly, keeping its geometry long after wind has stripped paint and roofs away. That is why monuments endure. But what of the things that powered those cities? The engines, the conduits, the invisible frameworks of survival. Stone may linger, but machines vanish fast. A century can rot iron to flakes. A millennium buries copper so deeply, it becomes part of the ore again. Yet supporters of the Martian civilization idea whisper that some traces may still hide, not in the open, but beneath dunes and rock. Imagine a survey image from orbit, bland at first glance, just a stretch of canyon wall. But when filtered for magnetics, faint lines emerge, as though something metallic once threaded below. The lines run parallel, too neat for faulting. Geologists chalk it up to mineral veins common in volcanic terrains. Still, the pattern tempts. Lines like conduits, fragments of an electrical grid long consumed by dust. Elsewhere, rover instruments sometimes register magnetic anomalies, pockets where the compass needle would twitch if a compass could function there. Engineers explain them as buried iron meteorites, plentiful on Mars because rust preserves them better than on Earth. But fringe voices ask whether some anomalies are too regular, echoing not random debris but deliberately placed alloys. What if the meteorites are the corroded bones of machinery? Picture again a Martian night thousands of years ago. Towers glow faintly, fed not by burning oil but by something stranger. Some claim Mars once tapped natural plasma streams, magnetic rivers running deep in crustal faults. Harnessing such currents would mean no smoke, no coal, only silent light spilling across domes. If that power faltered, the towers would darken in unison, like lamps extinguished by an unseen hand. A civilization lit not by fire but by currents. Currents that may still echo in the readings of today's rovers. There are stories, half forgotten, of underground hums. Early radio operators claimed faint signals sometimes rose from Mars during its closest approaches, static laced with rhythm too orderly for chance. Most scientists dismissed them as equipment noise, atmospheric bounce or imagination. Yet some recordings remain, jittery, unclear, but persistent enough to keep the rumour alive. If structures remain underground, perhaps they are not silent. Perhaps they still pulse, weakened but enduring, like a machine dreaming long after its operators are gone. The absence of visible machines on the surface may itself be clue. Metal corrodes quickly, yes, but glass can last for ages. Some high-resolution photographs show shards that glint unnaturally, reflective points in landscapes otherwise matte. Engineers call them fractured basalt or wind-polished rock. Supporters counter with a different thought. fragments of engineered glass melted in catastrophic firestorms, now scattered across plains. If the fire that ended Mars carried heat of nuclear magnitude, then even domes and conduits might have flash melted into crude obsidian. What remains would not look like machines, it would look like broken glass. On Earth, myths sometimes preserve fragments of lost technology. Tales of Vimanas in Indian epics, flying machines with great power, are usually read as metaphor, but when paired with the idea of hidden engines on Mars, those same stories read differently. Perhaps survivors carried memory of craft powered by plasma or nuclear cores. Unable to rebuild them, they retold them as vehicles of gods. The hum of engines became the hiss of serpents. The glow of reactors became divine fire. Critics push back firmly. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. To date, no rover has uncovered gears, inscriptions, or wires. Soil samples yield no fragments of alloys unknown to geology. Without such artifacts as hidden engines remain speculation. Yet here too the rebuttal raises questions. If an entire planet fell under immense catastrophe, how much would survive? On Earth, imagine a city erased by nuclear fire and sandstorms over 1 million years. Would laptops, turbines, and solar panels endure? Or would they grind to dust, leaving only odd mineral signatures? The lack of artifacts is not proof of absence. It is only absence. Picture standing on a Martian plain today. The land is silent, the sky thin, but below your boots may lie strata layered with more than geology. Buried seams of magnetized dust may once have been transmission lines. Veins of glass may be the residue of power stations flash melted in war. Anomalous radio signals may be the last breaths of machines running on auto long after their makers fell. To look for stone alone may be to miss the ghost of infrastructure. If such traces exist, then our understanding of Martian collapse deepens. The monuments, the face, the pyramids may have been symbols, yes, but symbols need systems beneath them. A society cannot carve kilometre-wide visages without energy, tools and coordination. To accept the monuments as possible implies that engines once hummed behind them. And if those engines burned too bright, if forbidden knowledge drove them past balance, then perhaps those very machines became the serpent, the fruit, the downfall. The haunting part is not the possibility of hidden machines, it is the possibility that they are still faintly alive. Energy grids sometimes persist as echo. Even when power is cut, capacitors bleed charge for minutes, hours, even days. Scale that upward to planetary networks. What if fragments of Mars' system still pulse, discharging across millennia? A weak hum in background static, a pulse in magnetic readings. Science shrugs them off, but myth seizes them as heartbeat. If that heartbeat is real, then Mars is not entirely dead. It sleeps with engines still twitching under dust. Supporters argue this could explain why myths on Earth often merge machinery with divinity. The survivors may have remembered not only stone faces but the hum of buried power, the glow of engines without fire. Unable to rebuild them, they mythologized them. We, their descendants, may still hear the hum faintly in radio noise and interpret it as chants. Yet perhaps in listening, we are overhearing the last lullabies of machines waiting for operators who will never return. The thought lingers, unsettling. Stone monuments might mark presence, but engines mark capability. If both once existed, then Martian civilization was not only symbolic, but technological. And if it ended in fire, it may have ended not because of weakness, but because of too much strength. If so, then what we inherit on Earth is not only memory of monuments, but memory of machines. Machines that lit skies, split atoms, and perhaps ended worlds. The question is whether we still carry that inheritance in our myths, disguised as gardens, serpents, and forbidden fruit. What if humanity never truly belonged to this world? The idea unsettles because it touches both science and faith at once. Our religions place us here by divine intent, chosen and moulded from this soil. Our sciences place us here through aeons of evolution, shaped by Earth's climate, oceans and sky. Yet there lingers another suggestion, unsettling in its simplicity. What if both stories are incomplete, missing the part where our ancestors stepped here not by birth but by exile? A refugee origin shifts everything. Earth ceases to be the cradle and becomes the shelter. Supporters of the Martian diaspora idea argue that myths reach across centuries not because they were invented in isolation, but because they work as fractured memory. They propose that our oldest stories are not inventions of morality but veiled recollections of catastrophe and survival. Myths of Eden, floods, serpents, and forbidden fruit, when assembled into sequence, become less allegory and more disguised history. Genesis, then, is not beginning but continuation. To read it as humanity's first dawn is to forget the twilight that came before, on another world now lying silent. Picture a preacher bathed in the glow of stained glass, unfolding scripture before a quiet congregation. He interprets Eden as an act of creation, a perfect garden set aside. His voice softens on every mention of sin and expulsion, lifting morality from myth. In another room, a poet bends over an old notebook, tracing familiar epic patterns from Mesopotamian clay tablets, seeing flood, survival, renewal written in verse over and over again. Across campus from both, an anthropologist sifts through oral tales told in the highlands of Papua, transcribing stories of first ancestors who wandered after fire consumed their homeland. 3 different lives, bound in pursuit of origin, each certain they are touching truth. None suspect they may be interpreting fragments of the same displaced memory. What drives humanity restlessly outward? Why, after millennia of making homes, do we not settle into contentment? Rockets into orbit, probes beyond Pluto, colonies imagined for barren planets. This hunger seems excessive for a species built purely on Earth. Some suggest it is symptom, not ambition. To them, our urge to leave Earth's atmosphere is not curiosity, but homesickness twisted across time. Refugees carry that instinct. Exiles build memories into bones, and their descendants inherit it subtly, like a rhythm beneath the skin. Supporters claim this is why our gaze tilts upward again and again. Not just stargazing, but searching. Searching for where we once stood. Psychology has a concept of ancestral memory. Traumas, patterns of stress, sometimes repeat across generations as if memory encoded itself not only in family stories, but within the very body. Modern studies point to descendants of wars, famines, disasters, who carry physical responses to stresses they never saw. One generation suffers hunger, another responds to food scarcity with elevated anxiety, yet another dreams of floods without having known one. Apply this to myth, and exile takes form. The survivors of Mars carried panic, devastation, knowledge of fire and famine. Their children inherited fragments. Their grandchildren turned those fragments into ritual, and further descendants codified them into religion. Memory transmuted into myth, hidden but indelible, hard to name but too persistent to ignore. The bones remember, even when the mind forgets. If so, then Eden deserves reinterpretation. In Scripture, it is a paradise broken by disobedience. In this frame, Eden is Earth itself. Newly arrived survivors walked in air richer than memory allowed, air that smelled of oxygen and plant resin instead of thin dust. Rivers roared wildly, insect hums crowded the forests, and fruit bulged from branches without demand for cultivation. Of course it felt divine, a perfect garden, yet trauma ensured it could not last. The knowledge carried from Mars, the forbidden fruit, would not stay buried. Consumption of that fruit equaled revelation, truth that risked repeating catastrophe. The paradise ended not because disobedience was committed, but because awareness returned. Creation myths, then, may tell less of divine artifice and more of shelter after calamity. The first place of safety, shielded by blue sky and abundance, later retold as paradise. Expulsion reflects not wrath, but memory of loss when survival turned into danger again. Reframed this way, Eden is not the source, but the memory of reprieve, an island of calm after an ocean of fire. The moral lessons attached later are human means of preserving memory, warning descendants not to reach again into knowledge that once burned a planet hollow. The motif of a perfect first place repeats across civilizations. Zoroastrian texts describe Arianem Vaija, the earliest land shaped by the Creator, once fertile but struck down by freezing disaster. In Mesopotamian lore, Dilmun appears as a place of abundance and purity before corruption entered. Polynesian chants speak of Hawaii, the original homeland across the sea, lush and abundant, remembered long after voyagers were scattered. Each is framed as a beginning, but each also carries undertones of a loss, as though the first place is always the one destroyed. Read through the lens of exile, these myths cease to be inventions of paradise, and instead look like fractured memories of refuge, Edens rewritten in different tongues. Imagine how such a world must have struck the first exiles from Mars. To step into Earth's forests after thin Martian air would feel overwhelming. Leaves crowding overhead, rivers roaring with terrifying abundance, fruit spilling from branches in colours too vivid to process. The survivors would have seen every detail heightened through trauma. The green of moss as miracle, the sound of insects as thunder, the scent of resin and soil as intoxicating excess. This sensory overload becomes scripture when passed down. What refugees called survival, later generations sanctified as paradise. This also explains why morality is woven so tightly into origin myths. Survivors do not preserve stories only as history. They encode them as boundaries. To survive, knowledge had to be hidden within taboo. Forbidden fruit, divine law, exile after disobedience. These are not arbitrary. They are warning labels disguised as divine decree. To tell descendants, a god punished disobedience is simpler and more binding than telling them our ancestors once destroyed a planet. In this reading, Eden is not only memory of abundance, but also an early survival manual, written in metaphor, meant to ensure the same fire never spread here. Across cultures, words differ, but structure persists. The Andean Huarochiri manuscript speaks of first ancestors climbing from a cave after destruction. Norse lore frames Asker and Embla as the first humans made from driftwood on a new shore. Aboriginal stories recall creation emerging after long cycles of fire, ash and renewal. Each story begins with survival amidst ruin. Each gives first humans memory of something prior, something obliterated. Critics argue this is natural for any culture reflecting on natural disaster. Supporters whisper it is not natural accident but inherited exile. Coded in language so old no text remembers the true name of origin. It is striking how origin myths consistently interweave morality into beginnings. Taboo, fruit, sin, forbidden associations, moral strictures arrive early. Normally, morality develops alongside society, but here it inserts itself into foundation. If seen as simple storytelling, it functions as cultural guidance. If seen through the lens of exile, it functions as warning left behind. Do not repeat the act we once committed. Do not open that knowledge again. The story is less divine command than survival instruction disguised as parable. Think of the tension. Faith insists humanity was shaped deliberate, chosen, moulded here under God's hand. Science insists humanity emerge gradual, one mutation at a time, grown from terrestrial soil. Both share one element. Origin remains Earth. Yet neither system allows Martian diaspora, refuge, continuity of exile. That third option sits uninvited at the edge of both frameworks, never resolved. but its presence unsettles precisely because it replaces certainty with inheritance neither science nor religion neatly accounts for. To believe it is to reframe every older story not as myth alone, but as diary of trauma. The poet raises his pen, inscribing symbols across a page. His hand trembles slightly, not only from age but from the sense of something greater pushing behind words. To him, it is memory from gods or muses. To another, it is unconscious inheritance. Martian tragedy disguised as divine inspiration. In the preacher's hall, words rebound with assurance of God's plan. Yet behind even his voice, patterns repeat that might echo older exile. To believe this is not to diminish wonder, but rather to amplify it, connecting faith, science, and myth into one strange survival story. In this frame, humanity's search upward across millennia takes on sharper meaning. Exploration becomes less ambition and more remembrance. Colonies imagined for Mars are not progress, but return. Technology designed to escape atmosphere is not simply curiosity, but instinct embedded by ancestors who once fled the same way. This story transforms rockets into ritual, probes into prayer. Machines crossing voids record not just exploration, but longing. The takeaway becomes heavy but clear. If humanity is seeded not as Earth's true native, but as survivors carrying memory from Mars, then myths of creation and Eden hold different weight. They're not stories of first Genesis. They are survival manuals disguised as morality, songs retold to hide trauma, diaries coded as scripture. They are messages saying, "We were not born here, yet we tried again here." And if such memory is true, then Eden written in red dust does not only call us back to origin, it stands as a reminder of mistakes that tore the first Eden away. And if memory endures in myth, then perhaps the greatest warning in Eden is not about obedience or temptation, but about remembering. For if stories are fragments of Mars, our inheritance is clear. Catastrophe is cyclical unless acknowledged. And should Earth repeat Mars' ending, the myths will again be retold. Fragments handed to another generation, searching for shelter against new sky. Humanity's eyes tilt toward the stars almost by instinct, as though looking upward is less a choice and more a compulsion buried deep inside the species itself. Astronomers often describe it as curiosity. Poets describe it as longing, and yet there is another word that fits with quiet unease: homesickness. A subtle hunger for something remembered dimly, passed through stories rather than fact, etched not in the sky, but in our bones. The question is unsettling because it asks whether our fascination with distant planets is wonder for the unfamiliar, or yearning for somewhere we once called home. Myths across cultures converge strangely on the idea of sky beings, deities descending in craft of fire, ancestors riding chariots of light, teachers arriving from above to deliver laws or seeds of wisdom. From the Dogon of Mali speaking of visitors from Sirius, to Hopi stories of ant people guiding humanity through destruction, a repeating framework emerges. Even Abrahamic traditions anchor themselves to encounters with radiant figures descending from heaven. Supporters suggest these tales preserve real impressions of contact, coded across generations. Critics dismiss them as imagination looking upward, simply because the sky has always held power over human survival and fear. Still, the repetition is hard to ignore. It is not only myth, it drifts into art, literature, even casual fantasy. Renaissance paintings show angels with radiant circles of light overhead. Science fiction pours century after century into visions of beings arriving from beyond, or humanity yearning to escape upward into new worlds. Popular culture repeats visits from stars, abductions, apocalypses arriving from above. If repetition alone marks significance, then this motif may be more than entertainment. Some whisper it reflects not mere storytelling patterns, but memory stirring beneath the surface, rising involuntarily like dreams passed down via bloodline. The truth cannot be tested, but the question lingers. Why does every expression of human imagination wander toward the firmament again and again? Picture a small child in a backyard, telescope balanced awkwardly on an old tripod. Autumn air chills, crickets pulse rhythm into the night as the child breathes through parted lips, adjusting focus. Through the scope, planets reveal themselves not as distant lights, but as round places with bands, storms and moons. Somewhere between Jupiter's stripes and Saturn's shimmering rings, something pulls silently inside that child's chest, an emotion difficult to name, perhaps awe, perhaps familiarity. Generations repeat this ritual, eyes through glass leaning into stars. Each feels personal, yet in aggregate they form a pattern. Our species seeks contact, even if only through borrowed lenses. Flood myths, tales of exile, stories of forbidden archives, they all circle back in form. Humanity flees disaster, carries fragments, hides dangerous knowledge, and wanders until renewal. Some frame modern space programs as another echo. Rockets roaring upward do not mark invention but reenactment. The Saturn V lifting Apollo toward the moon looks from far away like a ritual act. Flame and thunder accelerating memory toward sky. Space probes released into outer void carry carved plaques, golden records of greeting, not unlike myths of ancestors leaving signs for descendants. Is space science simply survival instinct recoded into technology? Or is it the echo of older journeys, repeating unconsciously, this time in stronger vessels? Modern science lends this idea unsettling weight. Studies on descendants of famine in the Netherlands during World War II show altered stress responses generations later. Children and grandchildren carrying metabolic markers of hunger they never personally endured. Survivors of the Holocaust passed measurable trauma to offspring through changes in hormones and gene expression. Psychologists call it epigenetic inheritance, memory, not in words but in biology itself. If such echoes persist after human wars and famines, how much deeper would a planetary collapse embed itself? Our very cells could still carry fragments of skies burning and homes abandoned. Ritual may be the cultural mirror of this inheritance. Why do so many ancient temples tilt upward, aligned with stars? Why do prayers rise to the heavens instead of sinking into the earth? Supporters of the Martian diaspora idea suggest these gestures are not arbitrary. They are subconscious reenactments of the first escape. The act of looking up became sacred because once, survival depended on it. Rockets roaring from launch pads may be celebrated as progress, but perhaps they are rituals in steel, echoes of ancestors fleeing a broken world, repeated with louder fire. Picture someone today pausing on a city sidewalk glancing at Mars through the haze. They do not know why the sight lingers, only that it stirs something unnamed, a tug in the chest, half awe, half ache. Most dismiss it as simple wonder, but in this frame that feeling is not curiosity at all. It is memory, too diluted to explain but too persistent to vanish. The bones remember even when the mind forgets. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, stretches antenna arrays to capture faint radio pulses. Scientists describe it as rational pursuit, calibrated by mathematics and probability. But in this frame it feels like something older, standing on shore, cupping hands, calling into darkness. What is more human than calling out to what we hope might answer back? Critics see pure curiosity, but supporters of exile memory see deeper. To them, SETI is less about contact with strangers and more about listening for kin thought lost. We scan sky radio noise not only because we want neighbours, but because we may want reminders, signals that someone survived with us. Across psychology, the concept of genetic or ancestral memory finds slow footing. Descendants of famine record anxiety toward food, though they never lacked meals themselves. Grandchildren of trauma victims sometimes inherit restlessness that fits no immediate context. Memory lays not only in spoken stories, but in how genes calibrate bodies for stress. Supporters of Martian diaspora latch onto this framework. They argue our celestial obsession is exactly this: stress from exile recomposed into instinct. Where ordinary ancestry creates fear of scarcity, planetary ancestry creates longing for return. It plays out not through household rituals, but through rockets leaping from launch pads. Critics counter that exploration needs no cosmic exile to explain. Curiosity may be instinct by itself, hewn into DNA by survival pressure. Looking past the tree line, climbing mountain ridges, sailing beyond shore, each advanced survival brought wealth of food, territory, partners. Evolution does not require planetary exile. Wonder emerges naturally when upward glance offers chance of gain. That explanation is simple, effective, yet it feels somehow incomplete when compared against the weight of cultural obsession sustained across time. It is one thing for curiosity to generate explorers. It is another for half of human myths to write deities who come from above, never below. Think of the gap between what is explained and what remains. Rockets roar, antennas turn. Fictions depict visitors dressed in light, all mainstream. The suggestion that these impulses are haunted by forgotten memories remains fringe, yet its presence colours everything. When a child raises telescope, perhaps she's not only nurturing curiosity, but participating in ritual that repeats across generations. The ritual itself may be souvenir, an echo deeper than story, one that sits in bone marrow, compelling reenactment of an ancient departure. Curiosity may simply be survival adaptation, or curiosity may be exile memory disguised as ambition. Supporters suggest that humanity's longing for other planets could be viewed less as exploring new ground, and more as reclaiming old ground. Colonizing Mars not as forward leap into novel frontier, but as homecoming after cosmic diaspora. Missions to Mars become return journeys, first hesitant landings echoing first hesitant steps by survivors millennia ago. For most, colonization feels like conquest of barren desert. For believers in exile, it is memory fulfilled. The red planet stands not as speculation but as homeland stripped by war then left barren. Our curiosity to test soil and drill rock is an unconscious desire to touch heritage again. Some whisper our myths of forbidden knowledge, dangerous fruit, and divine punishment serve dual purpose. They kept survivors cautious through early Earth generations, but also coded trauma into narrative so it could not be lost. These cautionary myths align eerily with moments today where science edges toward destructive thresholds. Atomic energy, genetic editing, climate shifts. Perhaps ancient warnings repeat unconsciously to remind us. Exile once came from hubris, and the signs are already visible when we look at Earth glimmering from space. Are we returning home, or rehearsing destruction all over again? The thought rests heavy. Curiosity itself may not be neutral. Curiosity drives invention, storytelling, voyages into impossible distance. Yet if our instincts are inherited, curiosity could itself be symptom. A trace of grief recorded in biology, urging us to repair what ancestors lost. Perhaps we're not simply toolmakers experimenting on chance, but children of another world carrying memory like weight. In every machine we send skyward, that weight surfaces, and in every child tilting telescope upward, that weight sustains. The key insight here is subtle but striking. Human curiosity, often painted as evolutionary advantage, might equally represent wound of displacement. The very trait that built telescopes, engines, orbiters, could be residue of exile. If true, then to understand human drive is not simply to chart psychology or biology, but to confront cosmic history. Our restless eyes betray us. We look up not because the stars are wondrous, but because they once framed a skyline we abandoned. And so, from myths of fires and floods, through stories of exile and Eden, all the way to rockets pointed outward today, the same pattern recurs. Each era encodes longing through its own language, but the impulse is consistent. Humanity will always gaze upward, as if rehearsing a script written long before memory. If these instincts are truly fragments of Martian survival, then our story is not merely progressive aspiration, but generational ache. The whisper in our blood does not call us to new worlds. It asks us not to forget the old one. And in that remembering lies not just identity, but warning of mistakes to come. Cities shimmer when seen from orbit, every light glowing like an ember against the canvas of night. From space the patterns look orderly, grids stretching outward, ribbons of highway, ports blinking in regular intervals. Yet from that same view, the planet itself is darker at the edges, oceans too warm, forests thinner than they once were. The glow of civilization is beautiful, but it also resembles something dying in a fire, bright on the edges, fading at the core. It is easy to mistake it for safety, yet it could just as easily be a warning signal visible only at distance. If Mars indeed met its end through violence and arrogance, we should ask carefully whether Earth walks the same road. The stories carved in myth are often dismissed as allegory, but if they cloak memory, then those warnings rise again not as metaphor but as precedent. Environmental decline, nuclear weapons, and an atmosphere slowly destabilized. These are not general tales but pressing realities. Mars may mirror only coincidence, but even coincidence here feels dangerous. When reflection shows ruin, it is hard not to weigh ourselves against it. Consider the slow unravelling of climate. Ice shelves fracture with echoing cracks, wildfires stretch further each year, and storms carve coastlines with startling force. These are geological whispers reminding us we balance precariously on systems we do not fully control. Some whisper Mars too once balanced on such a knife edge, oceans giving way, storms outrunning stability, air thinning until nothing remained. Whether natural or accelerated by choice, the result there was silence. Our position looks uncomfortably similar, though disguised by the temporary glow of electricity in abundance. Then there is the question of weaponry. For decades, arsenals have been gathered, refined, modernized. Not only large devices built for deterrence, but smaller ones, flexible and portable. A single launch could ignite chains across continents. Picture a factory worker at his station, sweat running along his brow as turbines hum around him. He knows the surge of current flows not only into the homes of families, cooling fans and cooking stoves, but into strategic industries that feed missiles. His hand wipes grease, but the thought lingers. The same currents feed comfort and catastrophe. The same hum sustains life and prepares for fire. This duality is not a distant idea. It is the very tension of progress. Every technology carries both blessing and hazard. Myths may record this conflict in symbols: the serpent, the fruit, the forbidden knowledge. In one frame, humanity receives power. In the other, humanity endangers itself by grasping too much. Supporters of Martian exile theory argue this tension encoded itself into myth, because those before us had already lived its outcome. They did not whisper of forbidden fruit by coincidence. They whispered of knowledge that once destroyed their world. The allegory is not about morality, it is strategy concealed in story. Critics counter such parallels as convenient. They argue myth naturally bends toward morality because every society requires rules. That does not require interplanetary precedent. Yet when environmental decay, arms races and cycles of greed appear again and again across myth, literature and present reality, repetition feels weighted. It feels as if we gather clues not designed as parables, but as alarms that simply repeat until heard. Each age rewrites them, yet the pattern underneath rarely changes. Picture again our glowing cities from orbit: Tokyo, New York, Cairo. Their lights radiate out across seas and deserts alike. The sight is arresting, But notice also what lies beyond. Stretches of dark where rainforest once grew, polar caps darkly shrunken. Satellites measuring infrared heat see not only light, but the excess warmth of crops, cars, factories. Civilization burns bright because it consumes heavily. The very brilliance that outlines human achievement in orbit is also record of accelerated use. Some whisper this glow is not just triumph but flare, a signal like a match head just before it burns out. If the isotope traces are what some believe, then Mars ended not in accident but in fire of its own making. That spectre lingers when we look at Earth today. Nuclear arsenals waiting, climate shifting, cities glowing bright while foundations thin. Whether Mars burned by weapons or time, the resemblance feels like warning. The same glow that marked their end now flickers in our skies. If that happened, then destruction was not quick. It was orchestrated by intelligence. Our myths then are less allegory than warning system, carrying across exile the lesson. Beware cycles that repeat. And repetition is what we see. Nuclear tests scarred deserts. Radiation found in bone and breath. Industrial discharge shifts atmospheric chemistry. Oceans turn acidic. Each decade sees inventions meant for life redirected toward violence. We call it deterrence, but deterrence functions by preparation for annihilation. This is the echo traced back toward Mars. If Mars indeed ended under its own hand, our trajectory is chillingly in step. History itself records fragments of what such endings look like. Hiroshima's stones still carry the shadows of people erased in an instant, silhouettes imprinted into walls. At Chernobyl, graphite glowed blue in open air, light that was not fire yet burned all the same. The Nevada desert still holds glassed craters where sand fused under test blasts. Each is a miniature apocalypse, brief windows into what planetary-scale destruction might resemble. Mars offers no monuments of melted steel, but its isotope traces suggest an echo of those same fires scaled until no recovery followed. To imagine its silence is to multiply our own scars by magnitudes we dare not measure. The pattern may not lie only in weapons or industry, but in psychology itself. The drive to dominate, to consume, to compete until collapse. Supporters of the exile theory suggest these instincts were inherited as much as brilliance and survival. If ancestors fled Mars carrying memory, they carried flaw too. We celebrate invention while ignoring appetite, forgetting that appetite once erased a world. Perhaps myth cloaked this in serpent and fruit, because it was easier to say do not disobey than to name the darker truth, that destruction comes when hunger outruns restraint. The cycle may not be accident, some whisper, it may be embedded. If humanity did inherit not only genes but instinct from survivors, then we inherited both brilliance and flaw. Pursuit of energy, mastery over nature, competition toward pride, each becomes strength before it becomes collapse. Our myths of fruit and serpent may be reminders built to resist repetition, but warnings do not always halt appetite. The serpent tempts, and the fruit gleams. Today it gleams as technology and growth, celebrated and marketed. Tomorrow it may gleam as weapons launched under flags. Memory lingers hidden, but appetite remains relentless. The worker at the factory wipes hands again, leaning exhausted near humming machines. He does not think of Mars, he thinks only of wages, of housing, of family. His condition is mundane, the very ordinariness of human survival. And yet, through his shift, immense systems intersect, turbines feeding both city and bomb. This is the scale of how destruction gathers, not by intent of one alone, but by millions simply participating. If Mars fell through war, it might not have been generals alone, but ordinary actions building until collapse. This mirror unsettles, for it means warning lies not only above us but within us. Supporters argue this cyclical trap is exactly why myth feels prescient. Each generation hears it as divine morality, Each overlooks its function as encoded memory, yet still the tale circulates, refusing to die. A culture as advanced as ours should not require myths to remind us of balance, and yet, perhaps myths remain because rationality alone forgets, while story endures. For if we repeat mistakes, it means facts fade too easily. Only narrative haunts enough to persist. At night, space never answers back. Beyond satellites and stations, the void is quiet. Distant stars flicker unchanged. Yet Earth glows restless, burning energy visible across the dark. In the calm silence above, the questions sharpen. If Mars was also once glowing, alive with its own signals of progress, what did their orbit look like on the eve of destruction? Brightness scattered across surface, unaware the end had already accelerated toward them? Perhaps survivors left warnings. Perhaps they became myth. Either way, silence waits for us as well if memory is ignored. The pattern tilts in reflection, clear but discomforting. Humanity may not be moving forward alone. We may be circling through patterns older than Earth's habitation itself. Fruit eaten once yields exile, eaten twice yields extinction. The takeaway is not certainty but risk, that humanity is trapped in cycles, carrying repetition in bones as much as curiosity. The question moves now from past to future. If Mars ended in fire and stillness, the path is open for us as well. The question hangs heavier than myth alone. If Mars once fell to its own brilliance and fire, what happens when Earth reaches that same threshold? Our lights already shimmer like warning flares from orbit, bright but fragile. The lesson of Mars, if true, is not only a record of failure but a map of what comes next. For survivors of that world, the path did not end in silence. It bent outward, across the void. If catastrophe repeats, would we have the will, or even the time, to do the same? Imagine the moment. Cities below darken one by one, not from nightfall but from collapse. Skies bruise with smoke. Oceans heave in ways satellites can no longer track. Families gather in basements, in temples, in subway tunnels repurposed as shelters. Politicians argue about rationing power, while engineers stare at launch pads, hands trembling with blueprints that were once only plans for exploration. In this frame, rockets become less about curiosity and more about lifeboats. The question is no longer should we leave, but can we leave in time? Supporters of the Martian exile theory point to this very instinct as proof of inheritance. They argue our obsession with space travel is less invention than remembrance, a subconscious recognition that survival once required leaving behind a burning world. When Elon Musk speaks of making humanity multiplanetary, critics scoff at the scale and expense. But for those who see echoes of Mars in our bones, such ambitions feel inevitable, almost prescripted. We dream of colonies on Mars not because it is convenient, but because it is familiar. It is return disguised as innovation. Picture the survivors of a future Earth catastrophe standing on a launch platform. Behind them lies a planet no longer safe, forests brittle with drought, oceans lined with salt flats. Before them rises a vessel streaked with frost, trembling with stored fire. Their faces are not heroic, they're gaunt with loss, eyes sunken from hunger. Yet when the engines roar, the vibration carries memory across thousands of years, repeating what ancestors once did on a smaller scale. The void swallows them, and again the cycle turns. Exile as inheritance, evacuation as destiny. But here lies the tension. Mars could once have seeded Earth. If Earth too collapses, where do we go? Jupiter's moons glitter faintly in the night sky. Europa's hidden ocean perhaps sheltering microbial life. Saturn's Titan smoulders with methane seas, strange but usable. Beyond, Proxima Centauri beckons, though it demands patience and propulsion far beyond our present reach. Some whisper that the next exodus might not be physical at all. Perhaps intelligence migrates not in ships, but in code. Minds stored in silicon. broadcast across the stars faster than fragile bodies can travel. A new arc, less of flesh and more of pattern. Critics counter sharply. They argue Exodus is fantasy. Earth is home, and Earth will be repaired or perish. They stress the impossibility of sustaining billions on another world, the cruelty of survival reserved for the few who escape. Yet supporters remind them myths never speak of billions. Myths always narrow to the few. Two shadows crossing the void, one family surviving a flood, one tribe carrying seeds into new soil. Inheritances are never fair. They are desperate. If Mars's survivors carried continuity in fragments, Earth's might too. Consider the role of myth in this preparation. Ancient tales often speak of chosen survivors warned before calamity, Noah building an ark, Deucalion and Pyrrha escaping flood, Hopi clans guided by ant people underground. In each story, survival is selective. Knowledge preserved by a handful becomes the foundation for many. Perhaps these myths are less about divine favour and more about grim logistics. Only a few can leave, and only they will carry memory forward. The injustice of survival becomes sanctified as destiny, softening the trauma for those left behind. Now picture the launch again, but from another angle. Inside a control room, operators watch telemetry flicker across screens. They know the ship is packed not only with passengers, but with seeds, embryos and libraries etched into crystal storage. DNA from forests, microbes from oceans, artifacts of language and art, all reduced into cargo weight. Humanity, compressed into numbers, entrusted to a fragile arc of steel. The operators may not live to see the ship arrive. Their role is only to press the button, to watch it vanish into cloud and flame, hoping that exile will once again become continuity. This is where the cycle grows unsettling. If we leave, are we repeating the Martian exile? If so, what becomes of Earth's myths? Will our descendants remember blue skies as paradise, rivers as divine abundance, fruit as forbidden gift? Will they reshape the trauma of evacuation into scriptures of loss and survival? And if one day they step onto new soil, will they write of Eden again? This time describing Earth as the first garden, destroyed by fire of its own making. The silence of Mars suggests that this cycle is not infinite. Each turn grows thinner, each memory more fractured. A second exodus may not guarantee a third. The bones may carry homesickness, but homesickness does not repair atmosphere or rebuild seas. Exile is survival, but it is also diminishment. Each repetition risks losing not only numbers, but essence. What if after enough turns, humanity is reduced not to civilizations, not even to myths, but to whispers scattered across stars, too faint for even memory to catch? Yet perhaps that is the only way stories persist. Not in one unbroken chain, but in fragments leaping world to world. Myths endure because they condense trauma into shapes simple enough to be retold. Faces carved in stone, pairs wandering after destruction, gardens lost, floods endured. If Mars seeded Earth, then Earth may one day seed another world. The pattern is not graceful, but it is persistent. Life refuses silence, even when civilizations do not. And so, the image lingers. A rocket's trail burning upward into night, watched by children who may never follow. To them, the streak of light may become legend, told in whispers as memory once told of floods and fires. And centuries later, descendants may look upward from another sky and wonder why their hearts ache for a planet they never knew. The ache itself becomes evidence. The cycle becomes scripture. The exodus becomes myth. In that telling, our story is not only about where we began, but about where we might be forced to go. If exile is the rhythm carved deepest into human history, then perhaps the rovers we send today are less explorers than scouts, quiet forerunners of another departure yet to come. What matters is not whether myth is allegory or memory, but whether it functions. If it guides us from repeating the cycle, then survival inherits purpose. If not, then our lights from orbit will someday resemble sparks scattered over a darkened world, beautiful only as relic. It comes down to choice, memory as guide, or warning declined. The quiet watches, and the next silence may define us. Dust scatters under metal wheels. A robotic arm extends and drills carefully into stone that has not been touched for millions of years. The sound is muted in the thin air, a faint vibration carried more through the rover's body than through the planet itself. Onboard instruments begin to hum, collecting powder into vials no wider than a thumb, storing them with quiet precision. The Perseverance rover carries out these tasks under the orange glow of a Martian afternoon, its cameras staring across an empty landscape of ridges and sand. The machine does not know what story it is part of. To it, there are only samples and readings, but to us, every scrape of the drill echoes larger questions hidden in myths. These missions speak in practical language. Engineers describe targets as sedimentary formations, possible signs of ancient deltas or volcanic layers. They phrase goals in terms of detecting chemistry, organics, isotopes, trace signs of water. From this perspective, the search is careful but restrained, aiming for proof of microbes. Modern science never leaps to the idea of cities. It asks only whether Mars once housed organisms that breathed, divided, and evolved in shallow seas. The imagery given to the public is never grand. Rock samples in clear tubes, data charts scrolling on monitors. It is factual, measured. Yet beneath those details lingers something science does not mention. The possibility that the evidence could tell multiple stories at once. The tangible element is clear. A sample can be touched, held, weighed. In sterile laboratories years from now, technicians will unseal Perseverance's containers, laying out powders and fragments for examination under microscopes. They will test for carbon-based molecules, magnetism, and isotopic ratios. All are reliable processes. What can never be bottled so neatly are the intangible fragments drifting through culture. Oral histories of floods, tales of exile, myths of serpent-like machines, all of them whispering of a past that does not fit into scientific categories. These two frames run alongside each other, never quite touching, but never silencing each other either. In a control room on Earth, operators watch the rover's progress with cautious pride. Screens glow as data arrives hour by hour. One worker holds up 2 sample tubes against fluorescent light, marvelling that inside could rest either simple dust or the first proof of ancient biology. The weight feels uncertain, heavy in ways not defined by grams. The operators know these fragments may shift history, but how they shift it depends on what story frames them later. Are they evidence of primitive microbes? Or could they serve, to some, as confirmation of forgotten civilizations erased by catastrophe? The workers do not decide that part. They only guard what might become evidence. There is a strange continuity in this gesture. Thousands of years ago, scribes pressed reeds into clay tablets, priests sealed scrolls in clay jars, and archivists tucked papyri into tombs, each convinced they were preserving something vital for the future. Today the containers are titanium tubes instead of clay, but the impulse is the same, to guard fragments against time. Perseverance's samples are not texts, but the weight carried by their sealed walls feels eerily similar. Whether dust or diary, what matters is that meaning has been trapped for later hands to decode. Imagine the day those tubes are finally opened. Technicians in clean suits move carefully inside sealed chambers, filtered air hissing through vents. Under bright white lamps, a pinch of dust spills onto a sterile glass slide. A microscope lens lowers, focusing on grains that have not seen light for millions of years. For one observer, it is nothing more than geology. For another, it may be the first glimpse of inheritance, the silent debris of a story myths have carried for centuries. The sample may whisper only chemistry, or it may whisper exile, The room itself, sterile and modern, will not shield its occupants from that weight. Supporters of Martian civilization theories interpret the same drilling differently. They see not just a hunt for microbes, but a search hovering near ruins, monuments half buried in sand. They ask whether organics might be genetic echoes of engineered beings, whether chemical residues could mark forgotten technology rather than natural decay. Critics dismiss such speculation easily. They argue the scale of evidence needed for a civilization is absent. No artifacts, no tools, no inscriptions. Soil cannot tell that story. Still, the drilling remains charged because symbols matter. The act of recovery itself looks ceremonial, scooping ancient matter, carrying it across distance, treating it as relic. The conversation expands each time a new mission arrives. Curiosity rovers before, perseverance now. Soon others will join. Each lands to search quietly, yet each also reawakens larger imaginations. For some, these missions are humanity reaching into another chapter of science. For others, they are humanity circling back toward its own hidden past. Two perspectives gaze at the same dust, one calling it geology, the other inheritance. Neither cancels the other. The data comes in numbers, the myth comes in echo. Both walk side by side, unwilling to retreat. Consider the way soil tells stories. Under microscopes, grains reveal layering, shaped by wind, by ancient water, by compression over time. Scientists will say those structures confirm Mars once held rivers and lakes. Supporters of broader theories add more. If those rivers existed, perhaps they supported more complex life forms, maybe even intelligent ones. They argue that civilizations vanish easily, leaving only the most durable imprints. How many traces survive on Earth beyond stone temples and mounds? If all were buried under sands for eons, would we expect more clarity than we now see on Mars? It is not proof, but the question itself unsettles. The operators who guide these rovers shoulder no myth. Their focus is detail. Commands, trajectories, sample collection. Yet the weight of culture always presses around them. Every press release brings speculation. Every image stirs arguments in late-night forums. To the worker in headsets, though, it may just be another shift. Eyes straining at code lines, fingers adjusting inputs. Still, when she sets the sample tube into its rack and listens to the soft click of it locking in place, she cannot know whether she has captured particles of lifeless rock or fragments of a history that rewrote itself as myth. That uncertainty shapes her silence. Microbes or civilizations, two answers waiting in the same dust. The first sits easily within established frameworks. It proves Earth is not alone in producing life, but does not upend religion or history. The second, only whispered at the edges, would tear frameworks open. Myths would change from allegory to memo. Histories of gods, floods and serpents would look less invented and more encoded. Critics insist such leaps are unsustainable. Yet at midnight in the quiet surrounding laboratories, the questions return without prompting. What was Mars once? What do these tiny samples hold beyond chemistry? Science and story operate with different logics. One speaks in clean procedure, the other in metaphors. But sometimes their paths entwine softly. When ancient myths describe worlds destroyed, and modern probes lift powders from unbroken stone, both point toward life before absence. They simply use different alphabets. What emerges is not competition. Neither field silences the other. Instead, they provide context like left and right eyes focusing image into depth. Though neither proves or disproves the Martian exile idea, together they build pressure, the sense that Mars may contain more than dust alone. In this way, today's exploration becomes twofold. Tangible data travels from rover to operator to lab. Simultaneously, intangible storylines circulate through myths, forums, and quiet speculation. Both are alive, both are enduring, neither will fade because neither can. Soil does not erase imagination, and imagination does not nullify soil. Their interplay has defined Mars for over a century of observation. It endures. So the drilling continues, unblinking. Steel bits cut into stone, vials click into rack, data pings across space. At the same time, myths circle of floods, serpents, exile, and survival. Neither process stops, and both shape the story we carry. One path may lead to the discovery of microbial remnants. The other may continue whispering of a civilization long buried. Together they create tension that neither science nor story can close. The samples sit quietly in their sealed tubes, waiting. Perhaps they hold chemistry with no meaning beyond geologic decay. Perhaps they carry traces that cast myths in new light. Either possibility shifts perspective. The truth, perhaps, is that both approaches, scientific detail and cultural tale, work together to keep Mars alive in our imagination. Neither erases the other. Instead, each frames the question so the other stays relevant. And that question sharpens now. If data and myth align, pointing in the same general direction, that Mars was alive once, perhaps even vivid, what do we do with it? When ancient echoes and modern instruments whisper toward the same memory, the weight only grows. The silence of the red planet carries both story and science, side by side. And together, they suggest an answer waiting just ahead, if we dare to listen. Our oldest myths might not be fictions at all, but blurred recollections, fragments of a homeland abandoned long before Earth's calendars began. Floods, serpents, forbidden fruit. Each could be memory dressed as allegory, echoes of Mars pressed into story so survival would not forget. If so, they warn not of gods, but of ourselves. A planet scarred by fire and loss asks whether Earth now drifts into the same pattern. Somewhere in the red dust may rest both proof of our beginnings and a reminder of our ending. The question lingers. Do we remember in time or repeat in silence? If Mars truly ended in fire, its silence is not empty. It hums still in our stories, the last ordinary day, the two shadows who crossed the void, the myths that turned survival into scripture. Perhaps we were never the beginning at all, but the continuation of a longer tale written first in dust, then in water, then in memory. And if so, the real question is not whether we are alone, but whether we will remember why they left.